In the autumn of 1944, the Allied armies had already liberated much of Western Europe. Paris was free. German forces were retreating east, and many believed the war might soon be coming to an end. But ahead of the advancing Allied soldiers stood something they had not yet faced. During the campaign across France, a German city, the city of Aachen. For centuries, Aachen had been one of the most important cities in German history. Long before the modern nation of Germany even existed, kings and emperors were crowned within its ancient cathedral. Its streets had witnessed the rise and fall of empires. But in 1944, those same streets were about to witness something very different. War had finally reached Germany itself. For the Nazi leadership, the idea that an enemy army could capture a German city was almost unthinkable. Losing Aachen would not just be a military defeat, it would be a symbolic blow to the entire regime. And so the order came directly from Adolf Hitler. Aachen would become a fortress, a city that must be defended at all costs. No retreat, no surrender. As American troops approached the western edge of Germany, they found themselves facing a massive line of defenses stretching across the landscape. Concrete bunkers, anti-tank obstacles, and fortified positions known as the Siegfried Line. Behind those defenses waited German soldiers ordered to hold the line. What followed was a slow and brutal battle fought street by street, house by house, as one of Europe's oldest cities was slowly reduced to ruins. Tonight, we'll explore the quiet story of that battle. So relax, settle in, and fall asleep to the history of the Battle of Aachen. It began with a city that had seen empires rise and fall, a place where ancient stones remembered the footsteps of kings. Aachen was not just another point on a map. It was a symbol, the old capital of Charlemagne, the city whose history stretched back over 1,000 years, a city that had watched centuries pass like seasons, a city that now found itself caught between two unstoppable forces, one retreating, one advancing, both preparing to turn its streets into a battlefield. By the autumn of 1944, the war had shifted. The Allies had broken free of Normandy, crossed France, and pushed toward Germany with a momentum that seemed, for a moment, unstoppable. But war has a way of reminding armies that nothing moves forward forever. Beyond the rivers and rolling fields lay the German border, and beyond that border lay Aachen, the first major German city the Americans would face, a city fortified not just by walls and bunkers, but by the weight of what it represented. Taking Aachen would send a message. Losing Aachen would break one. The Germans understood this. The Americans understood it, too. Before a single shot was fired, tension coiled around the city like fog. Civilians hid in cellars, listening for the distant rumble of artillery. German soldiers dug deeper into defenses, turning homes, schools, churches, and factories into strong points. Every street became a potential ambush. Every window, a firing position. Every intersection, a question mark. The Americans approached slowly, cautiously, feeling the resistance tighten with every mile. They knew city fighting was different, slower, closer, more brutal. They had trained for beaches, hedgerows, open fields. But Aachen would be something else. A maze of stone and smoke. A place where danger could sit behind any door. Where victory would be measured not in miles, but in rooms, in stairwells, in shattered bricks beneath their boots. The days leading up to the battle were filled with an uneasy quiet. Patrols probed forward, disappearing into narrow streets that seemed to swallow sound. Scouts reported glimpses of movement in broken windows. Artillery officers marked targets on maps with trembling pencils. Commanders argued over strategy, knowing that whatever they chose, the cost would be steep. Then slowly, almost gently, the weather shifted. Clouds thickened. The wind grew colder. Autumn settled over Aachen like a grey blanket, and the fighting began. At first, it came as scattered shots echoing through empty streets. Then, bursts of machine gun fire. Then, explosions that rolled through the city like thunder. The Americans advanced house by house, blowing holes through walls because stepping into doorways meant walking into death. Streets filled with dust that drifted like snow. Buildings collapsed into piles of broken memories. The air tasted of grit and smoke and fear. The Germans fought with a ferocity sharpened by desperation. They were defending their own soil now. They knew every alleyway, every rooftop, every cellar. Their orders were unforgiving. Hold the city at any cost. But the Americans pressed on, not quickly, not easily, but relentlessly. Infantry squads crawled through rubble, using craters as shelter. Tanks inched forward, turrets swiveling, guns ready to fire at shadows. Flamethrowers lit up basements where defenders waited in darkness. Rooftops became battlegrounds above the streets, where snipers played a quiet, deadly game. Each hour felt like a day. Each block felt like a campaign of its own. Slowly, inch by inch, the city began to crack. Some neighborhoods turned silent, emptied of resistance. Others erupted with sudden violence, as if the city itself were unwilling to surrender its secrets. But day after day, the circle tightened. German units grew smaller. Their supplies dwindled. Their communications faltered. The Americans, exhausted but unbroken, kept pushing deeper into the city's heart. And still, Aachen refused to fall quickly. It was a battle of attrition, of endurance. A fight where the weight of history pressed upon every soldier, American and German alike. But eventually, the inevitable came. When the city finally surrendered, it did not do so with fanfare or thunder. It did so with a tired, hollow quiet. Smoke drifted between shattered buildings. Streets once full of life now lay broken and empty. The ancient stones of Aachen, which had watched over a millennium of history, absorbed yet another chapter, one written in exhaustion, destruction, and sacrifice. Tonight, we return to that moment, to the slow, careful advance into a city older than memory, to the silent homes turned into fortresses, to the footsteps echoing through ruined streets, to the weight of a battle that tested the resolve of every man who stepped into its shadow. Before we begin, tell me, in words, where in the world you are tuning in from tonight, and what hour it is as you settle into this gentle journey through the past. Are you resting somewhere quiet, ready for sleep? Or can you almost feel the cool autumn air of Aachen drifting around you as the story unfolds? And if these slow, soft dives into history help you unwind, help you breathe, help you drift into sleep, consider subscribing. The finger stabbed at the map with such force that the paper crumpled beneath it. September 1944, deep inside the wolf's lair in East Prussia. And Adolf Hitler's hand trembled as it hovered over a small circle marked Aachen. Around him, generals shifted uncomfortably, their silence heavy with the knowledge that what the Fuhrer was about to decree defied all military logic. The city meant nothing strategically. No critical industries, no vital transportation hubs, no irreplaceable resources. Yet, Hitler's voice, when it came, carried the weight of absolute conviction. Aachen must never fall. It is the gateway to the Reich, the throne of Charlemagne, the birthplace of the German Empire. The generals exchanged glances but said nothing. They had learned that arguing with mythology was pointless. 1,500 years earlier, in the year 814, Charlemagne had been laid to rest in Aachen Cathedral. For 6 centuries afterward, 32 Holy Roman emperors had journeyed to this city to be crowned, each one placing their hands on the ancient throne, each one claiming the mantle of the First Reich. The Nazis had seized upon this history with desperate fervor, weaving Charlemagne, a Frankish king who had never considered himself German, into their mythology of eternal Germanic greatness. By September 1944, as Allied armies closed in from all sides, reality no longer mattered to Hitler. Only symbols mattered, only defiance mattered, and Aachen, with its cathedral and its throne, and its 800-year-old coronation hall, had become a symbol he could not afford to lose. The propaganda value was immense, even if the military value was negligible. The city had once held 165,000 souls. By early September 1944, that number had dwindled to perhaps 20,000. The rest had fled, some in official evacuations, most in panicked streams of refugees clutching suitcases and children. As Allied artillery rumbled closer from the west, those who remained did so for various reasons. The elderly, too frail to travel. The stubborn who refused to abandon homes their families had occupied for generations. The terrified who feared being shot by SS patrols for defeatism if caught fleeing. They huddled in cellars and listened to the explosions grow louder. They knew what was coming. The city sat just 5 miles from the Belgian border, 40 miles from the Netherlands, directly in the path of the American advance. Geography had made Aachen a target. History had made it a symbol. Hitler had made it a trap. On September 10, 1944, the first American artillery shells began falling on Aachen's outskirts. The sound was unmistakable, a distant thunder that grew closer each day, punctuated by the sharper crack of tank guns and the stutter of machine gun fire. In the cathedral, elderly priests moved through the medieval halls with purposeful urgency, gathering relics that had survived centuries of warfare. The crown of Charlemagne, brought out only for coronations, was wrapped in cloth and hidden. The golden shrine containing his remains was too large to move, so they built a false wall in front of it. Books and manuscripts disappeared into secret vaults. One priest, 73 years old and trembling with age, lowered a box containing fragments of the original throne into a space beneath the floor. They will destroy everything, he whispered to his younger colleague, just as they did in Poland, just as they did everywhere. The younger priest said nothing. What could he say? The old man was probably right. Nazi propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels understood the symbolic stakes perfectly. On September 13th, his voice crackled across German radio waves, reaching into homes from Hamburg to Munich. Aachen is the gateway to the Reich. The city of Charlemagne, the city where German emperors were crowned, must stand as proof of our unbreakable will. Here we stand or fall. Here we show the world that no enemy will ever set foot on sacred German soil. It was magnificent rhetoric. It was also a death sentence for the 5,000 soldiers who would be ordered to defend the city, and the 20,000 civilians trapped inside with them. Goebbels spoke from the safety of Berlin. The soldiers and civilians in Aachen would pay the price for his words. The Americans didn't understand, not yet. To them, Aachen was just another German city, larger than most, but strategically similar to dozens they'd bypassed or captured during the race across France. Intelligence reports noted its position astride key road networks leading deeper into Germany. Reconnaissance photographs showed fortifications, pillboxes, dragon's teeth, anti-tank obstacles, the concrete bunkers of the Siegfried Line surrounding the city like a collar. But nothing suggested Aachen would be different from Cherbourg or Saint-El or any of the other fortified positions they'd cracked open with artillery and determination. They expected resistance. They expected casualties. They didn't expect a battle that would consume 40 days, 5,000 American lives, and an entire city. The symbolism wasn't lost on Germany's civilian population, even if foreign observers missed it. When Hitler declared Aachen must hold, when Goebbels proclaimed it the test of German will, millions of Germans understood the message. If Aachen falls, the Reich itself begins to fall. The city wasn't being defended for military reasons. It was being defended because admitting the First Reich's birthplace could be conquered meant admitting that the Third Reich was mortal. Nazi ideology couldn't tolerate such an admission. Better to sacrifice 5,000 soldiers and 20,000 civilians than acknowledge the obvious truth, that the war was lost. This was the perverse logic of a regime in its death throes. Symbolism trumping strategy, propaganda demanding victories that military reality couldn't provide, ideology requiring sacrifices that served no purpose beyond feeding its own mythology. By mid-September, the sound of American artillery was constant. Residents who ventured into the streets during lulls in the bombardments found their city transformed. Buildings they'd known their entire lives now gaped open, exposing rooms to the sky like dollhouses. Streets were cratered and impassable. The Elisenbrunnen, the neoclassical pavilion that had stood for over a century, had taken a direct hit. The roof of the Rathaus, the city hall where Charlemagne had once held court, showed ominous cracks. Each explosion was an erasure, removing piece by piece the physical evidence of Aachen's centuries of existence. The remaining civilians began to understand what the soldiers already knew. The city was going to be destroyed. The only question was how many would die with it. On September 11th, Nazi officials posted evacuation orders throughout the city. Residents had 24 hours to gather what they could carry and leave. Those who remained would be considered defeatists or worse, traitors. The penalty for defeatism was death. Yet, even this threat couldn't empty the city. Families gathered in cellars to debate impossible choices. Leave and risk being shot by SS patrols for abandoning the Reich. Stay and risk being killed in the bombardment. Some made the calculation that staying meant certain death, but leaving meant possible death, and chose to flee. Others decided the risks of flight outweighed the risks of remaining. Still others, simply paralyzed by terror, unable to choose at all, and so remained by default. One elderly woman, interviewed decades later, remembered her father's words that night: "If we leave, they'll shoot us as deserters. If we stay, the Americans will kill us. We're dead either way. We might as well die in our own home." The stage was set. Hitler had declared Aachen must not fall. Goebbels had transformed the city into a symbol of Nazi defiance. 5,000 German soldiers were being positioned to defend the indefensible. 20,000 civilians were trapped inside. And approaching from the west, confident and powerful and utterly unprepared for what awaited them, came the American forces that would spend the next 40 days, learning that taking a city defended by fanatics and ideology costs far more than any map could suggest. The ghost of Charlemagne watched from his ancient throne as the city bearing his legacy prepared to become a graveyard. The battle for Aachen, first major German city to fall, bloodiest urban combat Americans had yet experienced, and proving ground for every urban battle that would follow, was about to begin. September 11, 1944. The American patrol moved cautiously through the wooded hills near Aachen, Germany, just across the Belgian border. They'd been advancing for weeks, the intoxicating rush across France giving way to a more cautious progress. As they approached the German frontier, the lieutenant leading the patrol held up his fist, signaling halt. Through the trees ahead, something geometric caught the light, something that shouldn't be there. The men spread out, rifles ready, approaching slowly. What they found made them stop and stare. Rising from the earth in perfect rows, concrete pyramids stretched in every direction, each about 3 to 5 feet tall, arranged in staggered lines that disappeared into the forest. The soldiers approached warily, touching the structures, kicking them. Solid concrete, reinforced, immovable. "What the hell are these?" someone asked. The lieutenant had no answer. He'd never seen anything like them. These were the dragon's teeth, and they were just the beginning. The West Wall, called the Siegfried Line by the Allies, represented Hitler's vision of an impenetrable Western defense, constructed between 1938 and 1940. 380 miles long, stretching from the Netherlands to Switzerland, it comprised over 18,000 bunkers and pillboxes, tank ditches up to 10 feet deep, and those endless rows of concrete pyramids designed to stop Allied armor cold. The fortifications had been built with German engineering precision and unlimited labor, much of it forced. Each concrete pyramid was individually anchored into bedrock or massive concrete foundations, arranged so that even if tanks destroyed the first row, subsequent rows would catch them, with damaged treads or bellies exposed. The Germans had spent years calculating firing angles, interlocking fields of fire, fallback positions. The dragon's teeth were medieval castle thinking applied with modern materials, and no one in the American command structure fully understood what they were facing. September 14, 1944. An intelligence briefing tent somewhere behind the American lines. Officers crowded around grainy reconnaissance photographs spread across a folding table. The photos showed what aerial observers had documented. Line after line of fortifications, the dragon's teeth casting long shadows in the afternoon light. Pillboxes barely visible beneath camouflage netting. Tank ditches like scars across the landscape. A colonel pointed at one photograph, his finger tracing a route that wound between fortification clusters. "We'll push through here," he said confidently. 3, maybe 4 days to crack the line. Standard doctrine: artillery prep, infantry assault, armor exploitation once we're through. Other officers nodded. They'd broken through German defenses before. France had taught them that firepower and determination could overcome any static defense. None of them had studied the West Wall's engineering closely enough to understand that this wasn't like anything they'd faced before. The pillboxes were engineering marvels and tactical nightmares. Constructed of reinforced concrete, 3 feet thick, they'd been designed to withstand anything short of direct hits from heavy artillery. Each one featured multiple firing slits positioned to cover specific killing zones, with interlocking fields of fire ensuring no dead ground existed in front of the defensive line. Inside, German machine gun crews had pre-measured ranges to every possible approach with white-painted markers on the walls showing proper aim points for different distances. Ventilation systems provided fresh air during bombardments. Steel doors led to underground tunnels connecting pillboxes, allowing defenders to reinforce threatened positions or evacuate damaged ones without exposing themselves to fire. Some larger bunkers included sleeping quarters, ammunition storage, medical facilities, everything needed to survive a siege. The Americans had nothing in their tactical manual for cracking such positions, because they'd never imagined defenses this sophisticated. September 16, 1944. Combat engineers gathered around their first captured dragon's tooth, preparing to test demolition techniques. They'd brought standard explosive charges, the kind that cracked German concrete bunkers in Normandy. The explosion was impressive, a thunderous blast that sent smoke and dust billowing. When the air cleared, the engineers approached to examine the damage. The pyramid stood exactly as before, except now it had a black scorch mark on one side. A sergeant placed his hand on the concrete, feeling for cracks. There were none. "Son of a bitch," he muttered. They doubled the charge. Same result, scorching, but no structural damage. It took 4 times the standard explosive load to finally shatter one pyramid, and the men realized with sinking certainty that they faced thousands of these obstacles. Clearing a single lane wide enough for tanks would require more explosives than they had, more time than the operation allowed, and would expose engineers to withering fire from the pillboxes covering the obstacles. A captured German engineer, interrogated on September 20th, revealed details that made American commanders go pale. The tunnels connecting the bunkers ran 4 miles in some sectors, he explained through an interpreter. Underground rooms stored enough ammunition to withstand weeks of siege. Water came from deep wells. The Germans had learned from Maginot Line mistakes. These fortifications could be supplied and reinforced from the rear, making them far more than isolated strongpoints. "You can capture one pillbox," the engineer said with something like pride, "but the others will kill you while you try. You can destroy the dragon's teeth in one area, but machine guns from concrete bunkers will cut down anyone trying to advance through the gap. The West Wall is a system, not a lion. You must defeat the entire system, not individual pieces." The intelligence officer conducting the interrogation wrote an urgent report that night, warning that current tactical estimates 3 to 4 days to breach the line were dangerously optimistic. American doctrine emphasized mobility and firepower. Bypass strong points when possible, outflank when you can't bypass, reduce with overwhelming force when flanking proves impossible. But the West Wall didn't allow flanking. It stretched 390 miles, far beyond any reasonable envelopment attempt. Bypassing wasn't an option, either. Supplies couldn't flow forward, while German forces held the fortified line across every major road. That left reduction by overwhelming force, which meant accepting casualties that made commanders wince. The engineers estimated clearing paths through the dragon's teeth would take 1 week minimum. Infantry estimated that taking the bunker lines behind the teeth would cost 300 to 400 casualties per mile of advance. Artillery officers calculated they'd need to fire 10 times their normal expenditure of shells. Everyone agreed this would be nothing like France, where German forces had been mobile and vulnerable. This would be grinding, bloody work against an enemy who'd literally fortified every foot of ground. The psychological impact of the West Wall on German defenders was precisely what Hitler had intended. Soldiers manning the bunkers felt the concrete's protection, the engineering sophistication, the system's strength. They'd watched the construction for years, participated in exercises demonstrating how interlocking fields of fire left no safe approach. Their officers had told them the West Wall was impregnable, and after manning these positions for weeks, many believed it. This confidence translated into stubborn resistance. American intelligence reports from interrogated prisoners revealed that while German troops in France had often seemed demoralized and willing to surrender, those in West Wall positions showed renewed determination. The fortifications gave them hope that they could actually stop the American advance, that Germany might yet avoid defeat. This meant they would fight harder, hold longer, and extract maximum casualties for every yard of ground. September 24, 1944, the first major American assault hit the West Wall near Aachen. The artillery preparation was impressive, hundreds of guns firing thousands of shells. The bombardment so intense that earth and concrete dust hung in the air like fog. Then came the infantry, advancing in textbook formations, engineers in front to clear obstacles. German machine guns opened fire from pillboxes that had survived the bombardment. Men fell by the dozens. Tanks attempted to advance, but became channeled by Dragon's Teeth into killing zones where anti-tank guns waited in camouflaged positions. By nightfall, the Americans had gained perhaps half a mile at a cost of over 300 casualties. Officers reviewing the day's reports struggled to accept the mathematics. At this rate, reaching Aachen would take weeks and cost thousands. The Dragon's Teeth had drawn first blood, and the Germans behind them hadn't even fully committed their reserves yet. The West Wall wasn't just a military obstacle. It was a statement of intent. Germany might be losing the war, retreating on all fronts, suffering defeat after defeat. But here, on German soil, behind fortifications built with German engineering and defended by German will, the Allies would learn that conquering the Reich would require paying in blood for every mile. The Dragon's Teeth represented more than concrete and geometry. They embodied Nazi determination to make victory so costly that perhaps, impossibly, the Allies might negotiate rather than continue paying the price. It was delusional, thinking the war was already lost, but delusion mixed with excellent engineering created a formidable barrier. The Americans stared at those rows of concrete pyramids and realized that the easy war, the race across France, was over. Ahead lay the hard war, the kind where gains were measured in yards and losses counted in body bags. Welcome to Germany. Welcome to the West Wall. Welcome to the Dragon's Teeth. September 11, 1944, dawn. Nazi officials moved through Aachen streets, posting notices on walls, doors, and lampposts. The paper fluttered in the early morning breeze. Stark black text on white background. Evacuation order. All residents must leave Aachen within 24 hours. Those remaining will be considered defeatists and enemies of the Reich. By order of the Gauleiter, the officials moved efficiently, hammering notices beside front doors, saying nothing to residents who watched from windows. By mid-morning, the proclamation entire city knew. 24 hours. Leave your home, your possessions, your life. Leave or die. The officials didn't mention where residents should go, how they should travel, or what would happen to those too old or sick to flee. Those details were apparently unimportant. In cellars and living rooms across Aachen, families gathered to debate the impossible. Ernst Weber, a 53-year-old shopkeeper, sat with his wife and elderly mother reading the notice for the third time. His hands shook slightly. "If we leave," he said slowly, "the SS will stop us. They're shooting deserters. We'll be accused of abandoning our duty to the fatherland." His wife, Marie, shook her head. If we stay, the Americans will bomb us to rubble. We've heard what happened in other cities. Ernst's mother, 81 years old and barely able to walk without assistance, spoke quietly. I cannot travel far. You should leave without me. The silence that followed was unbearable. They were not discussing logistics. They were discussing who would live and who would die. This conversation was happening in thousands of Aachen homes that morning, thousands of families calculating which choice offered the slimmest chance of survival. The evacuation order was theater, not policy. The Nazi leadership didn't actually want Aachen empty. Empty cities couldn't be defended. And defending Aachen symbolically required inhabitants to demonstrate German courage under fire. What they wanted was the appearance of humanitarian concern, so that when thousands died in the coming battle, the regime could claim it had warned them to leave. The SS units positioned throughout the city reinforced this cynical calculation. They had orders to prevent defeatism, which in practice meant shooting anyone who tried to flee. Several families attempting to leave on September 12 were stopped at roadblocks, the fathers taken aside and executed for desertion. Their bodies were left visible as warnings. The message was clear. The evacuation order was propaganda, not permission. You could leave, but they'd kill you for trying. September 13th brought a different kind of notice from the sky. American aircraft dropped thousands of leaflets over Aachen, white paper fluttering down like snow. Maria Schneider, a 37-year-old nurse, caught one as it fell past her window. The English text had German translation below. To the civilians of Aachen, leave the city immediately. American forces will bombard military targets. We cannot guarantee your safety if you remain. This is your final warning. She read it 3 times, then looked at the Nazi notice still posted on her door. 2 warnings, 2 threats. The Nazis threatened to shoot her if she left. The Americans threatened to bomb her if she stayed. She crumpled both papers in her fist and descended into the cellar where her 2 children waited. We're staying, she told them. God help us. The civilians who remained, approximately 20,000 out of an original 165,000, did so for complex, overlapping reasons. Some were elderly or infirm, physically incapable of fleeing. Others had nowhere to go. Their relatives in other cities were dead or unreachable, and wandering German roads as refugees seemed equally dangerous as staying put. Many feared SS reprisals more than American bombs, calculating that at least bombs were impersonal, while SS execution squads were deliberate. Some stayed out of stubborn attachment to homes their families had occupied for generations. The Nazis and Americans might destroy each other, but they'd be damned if they'd voluntarily abandon everything they owned. And a few, a very few, stayed because they still believed in Nazi victory, convinced that German soldiers would throw back the Americans and save the city. These true believers would be disappointed. September 15, 1944, mid-morning. Frau Hoffmann, 68 years old, decided she could no longer endure the cellar's darkness and fear. She needed to see the sky. She climbed the stairs to her ground-floor apartment, found a white bedsheet, and walked into the street carrying it before her like a flag. She'd heard that white flag signaled surrender, non-combatant status. Perhaps the soldiers, German or American. She no longer cared which would see the white cloth and leave her alone. She'd walked perhaps 30 yards when the shock came. It could have been a nervous German soldier, seeing movement and firing reflexively. It could have been an SS officer enforcing no surrender orders. The bullet caught her in the chest, and she fell. The white sheet spreading around her on the cobblestones, turning red. Her body lay in the street for 2 days before anyone dared retrieve it. The message was delivered. There would be no surrender, no mercy, no escape. The psychological toll on trapped civilians manifested in different ways. Some descended into near catatonic states, sitting in cellars, staring at walls, speaking rarely, eating little. Others became frantically active, constantly rearranging their hiding places, moving supplies, checking and rechecking escape routes that everyone knew led nowhere. Parents struggled to maintain normalcy for children who'd forgotten what normal meant. One mother taught her daughters mathematics by lamplight in their cellar, the lesson repeatedly interrupted by explosions above them, continuing each time in the sudden silence that followed. Another family said prayers every evening at precisely 6 o'clock, maintaining the ritual even when artillery bombardments made the words nearly inaudible. These small acts of normalcy were defiance, proof that they remained human despite the inhuman situation crushing them. By early October, the civilian situation had deteriorated catastrophically. Water supplies were contaminated or cut off. Food stocks dwindled to nothing. The Nazi authorities, who'd ordered everyone to stay now, provided no support, no supplies, no protection. Civilians survived on hidden caches and whatever they could scavenge during lulls in the fighting. Several families attempted to leave through American lines, waving white cloths, shouting "Nicht Soldaten," not soldiers. Some made it, others were shot, sometimes by Germans preventing defeatism, sometimes by Americans unable to distinguish civilians from soldiers in the chaos of urban combat. One 8-year-old boy, interviewed 70 years later, remembered, "We lived like rats. We hid in cellars and ruins. We ate whatever we found. We tried not to make noise because noise meant someone might notice us, and being noticed meant dying." October 10, 1944. The Americans issued a final ultimatum. Loudspeakers mounted on vehicles broadcast the message in German. "Civilians of Aachen, you have 24 hours to evacuate through designated corridors. After that time, the city will receive full artillery treatment. Anyone remaining will be considered hostile." This time, many civilians attempted to flee. German soldiers, exhausted and overwhelmed, no longer had the energy to enforce SS anti-defeatism orders. Long lines of civilians, elderly men supporting each other, women carrying children, teenagers pushing carts loaded with whatever they could carry streamed through the rubble. Toward American positions, they moved slowly, fearfully, expecting bullets from either direction. Most made it, but not all, and the several thousand who remained, whether through inability to move or simple paralysis of will, huddled in their cellars and waited for the artillery treatment to begin. The civilians trapped in Aachen were victims twice over, victims of Nazi ideology that valued symbolic resistance over human life, and victims of military necessity that required attacking a fortified position, regardless of who sheltered within. Neither side intended to murder civilians, but both sides created conditions that made civilian death inevitable. The Nazis by forbidding evacuation and using the city as a fortress. The Americans by attacking that fortress with every weapon available. The 20,000 trapped between these forces had committed no crime, except living in a historically significant city at the worst possible moment. They would pay for that geographic misfortune with their lives, their homes, and their sanity. When the battle ended, survivors would emerge from cellars blinking in the light, staring at the rubble that had been their city, and understanding that they had witnessed the future of warfare. The city as battlefield, the civilian as collateral, urban combat as shared nightmare for everyone it touched. September 13, 1944, 0600 hours. The lead Sherman tank of the 3rd Armored Division rolled forward through early morning fog. Near Stolberg, Germany, the town that controlled the northern approach to Aachen. Inside, Sergeant James Mitchell listened to the engines rumble and tried to ignore his hand's slight tremor. This was supposed to be the easy part: reconnaissance in force, probe German defenses, report back. They'd done this dozens of times in France. German resistance had been crumbling for weeks. Everyone expected the same here. Mitchell's tank rounded a bend in the road, emerging from tree cover into an open field. That's when the world exploded. The German anti-tank round hit the Sherman's front armor with a sound like a giant hammer, striking a bell, the tank lurching sideways from the impact. Mitchell's driver screamed into the intercom, "Reverse! Reverse! Reverse!" They backed frantically into the tree line while 2 more rounds gouged the road, where they'd been seconds before. The 3rd Armored Division had earned glory racing across France, covering ground at speeds that made newspaper headlines and Eisenhower smile. But the Stolberg Corridor, a narrow approach between Aachen and the industrial town of Stolberg, was nothing like France. Here, German forces had prepared positions for weeks, registering artillery on every possible approach, positioning anti-tank guns with clear fields of fire, laying mines along likely routes. Here, the Americans couldn't use their mobility because terrain channeled them into predictable paths. And here, defending forces included elements of Germany's elite 12th Infantry Division and the 9th Panzer Division, veteran units that had survived the Eastern Front and knew exactly how to make attackers bleed. The Americans were about to receive an expensive education in the difference between pursuit and assault, between fighting a retreating enemy and attacking a prepared defense. September 14, 1944, 1400 hours. Lieutenant Colonel Samuel Hogan's battalion had been trying to advance 1 mile for 6 hours, and had gained perhaps 200 yards. Every 100 yard gained cost casualties, a sniper's bullet, a mortar round, a machine gun opening up from an unexpected position. Hogan crouched in a ditch beside his radio operator, listening to company commanders report their situations. Able Company pinned down, taking fire from buildings ahead. Baker Company attempted flanking maneuver, ran into minefield, 3 casualties. Charlie Company requesting artillery support on bunker position. Coordinates follow. The reports blended into a litany of frustration and loss. Hogan had commanded this battalion across France, where they'd advanced 10 miles on good days. Now they were measuring progress in yards and losing men faster than they could be replaced. The tank battles revealed the brutal mathematics of German defensive advantages. American Sherman tanks mounted 75mm guns that could kill German Panther tanks at 500 yards or less, assuming they hit the Panther's thinner side or rear armor. German Panthers mounted a long-barreled 75mm guns that could kill Shermans at 1,500 yards by shooting straight through the front armor. This meant German tanks could engage and destroy American tanks from distances where American return fire was ineffective. The Americans' numerical advantage, they had far more tanks, became meaningless when German tanks could kill 3 or 4 Shermans before the Americans got close enough to fight back. Tank crews understood this mathematics with terrifying clarity. Every advance toward German positions was a calculation. How close could they get before German guns acquired them? How fast could they close that lethal gap? How many would die in the attempt? September 16, 1944, a regimental aid station behind American lines. Captain David Goldman, battalion surgeon, worked by lamplight as stretcher bearers brought in another wave of casualties. Sucking chest wound, stabilize, evacuate. Shrapnel peppered through both. Legs tourniquet, morphine, evacuate. Abdominal wound, already shocky. Nothing to be done. Make him comfortable. The casualties kept coming, a steady stream that overwhelmed the medical staff's ability to cope. Goldman had been processing wounded since dawn. It was now dusk. His surgical gown was soaked with blood that wasn't his. His hands shook with exhaustion as he worked. Between patients, he glanced at the triage log his assistant maintained. 73 wounded processed today, 16 dead on arrival. Probably 20 more who died before reaching the aid station. 1 battalion, 1 day, 1 mile of advance. The mathematics were unsustainable. The casualty ratio terrified American commanders more than the absolute numbers. Military doctrine suggested attackers should expect 3-to-1 casualty disadvantage. When assaulting prepared defenses, lose 3 men to kill 1 defender. The Stolberg fighting was producing 4-to-1 or even 5-to-1 ratios. For every German killed or captured, Americans were losing 4 or 5 killed, wounded, or missing. This meant the Germans could trade space for casualties at rates that would grind American offensives to halt through sheer attrition. General J. Lawton Collins, the V Corps commander, nicknamed Lightning Joe for his aggressive tactics, studied the reports with growing alarm. His corps was supposed to be the spearhead, the fast-moving exploitation force that would crack Germany open. Instead, they were being bled white against defenses that seemed to grow stronger the deeper they penetrated. The terrain around Stolberg favored defenders in every possible way. The Americans attacked from the low ground, advancing uphill toward German positions that offered perfect observation. Every American movement was visible to German observers who could call artillery fire with pinpoint accuracy. Meanwhile, German positions on the heights were difficult to spot, well camouflaged, and positioned to provide interlocking fields of fire that left no safe approach. Tank crews described the sensation of being in a fishbowl. They could see some German positions, but suspected others they couldn't see, never knowing where the next Panzerfaust or anti-tank gun would fire from. Infantry learned to dread open ground between buildings, those 20 or 30 yards where machine guns from multiple positions could converge. Speed was survival, but tired men carrying 70 pounds of equipment couldn't sprint far. September 18, 1944, evening briefing at division headquarters. Colonel Truman Boudinot, commanding Combat Command B of the 3rd Armored Division, stood before a map showing the past week's gains. His finger traced a line that barely moved. Starting position on September 13th, current position on September 18th. 5 days, 1 mile, 317 casualties. The division commander, Major General Maurice Rose, studied the map in silence. Finally, he spoke. "We can't sustain this pace. At current rates, we'll need 2 months and 10,000 casualties to take Aachen. We need new tactics, better intelligence, more support. Or we need to reconsider the entire operation." The officers present understood what he wasn't saying directly. They were losing this battle and losing badly. The 1st Infantry Division, the big red one, joined the fight on September 19th, attacking toward Aachen from the southeast while the 3rd Armored pressed from the north. The plan was to converge on the city, envelop it, force German surrender through encirclement rather than frontal assault. It was sound strategy, but the execution ran into the same problems that had stalled the 3rd Armored. Prepared defenses, favorable terrain, determined resistance, and casualty rates that shocked commanders used to mobile warfare. By September 23rd, the Big Red One had advanced approximately 2 miles, at a cost of 450 casualties. Officers privately calculated that taking the city at this rate would require 6 weeks, and 5,000 casualties. No one dared say what everyone knew. Those estimates were probably optimistic. The failure at Stolberg shattered American confidence in their tactical doctrine. Everything they'd learned in France, advance quickly, bypass strong points, use mobility to avoid set-piece battles, proved useless against an enemy who couldn't be bypassed and wouldn't retreat. The comfortable certainty that American firepower and determination could overcome any obstacle evaporated in the face of German defenses that absorbed punishment and kept fighting. Soldiers who'd felt invincible racing across France now felt vulnerable and mortal. Tank crews who dominated French battlefields now feared every advance. Infantry who'd grown accustomed to German surrenders now faced enemies who fought from prepared positions and extracted maximum casualties before falling back to the next defensive line. The easy war was over. The hard war, the one that would test everything they thought they knew about combat, had begun in the blood-soaked ground around Stolberg and Aachen, and they'd barely scratched the surface of what awaited them inside the city itself. September 16, 1944. The Wolf's Lair in East Prussia. Adolf Hitler hunched over maps in the operations room, his left hand trembling with the palsy that had worsened over recent months. Around him stood generals who'd learned to mirror whatever conviction the Fuhrer projected. Knowing contradiction invited rage, or worse. Hitler's finger jabbed at Aachen again, the city that obsessed him beyond any military logic. "The Americans must be stopped here," he said, voice rising. "Aachen will be defended as a fortress, not one step back. The city where German emperors were crowned cannot fall to these barbarians." He looked up, scanning the faces of his staff. "Any commander who withdraws from Aachen without my explicit permission will be shot. Any soldier who retreats will be shot. The city stands, or Germany falls. The generals exchanged glances but said nothing. They'd heard these pronouncements before. Stalingrad, Tunisia, countless other positions declared fortresses that became mass graves. The Festung Fortress City doctrine was Hitler's response to Germany's strategic collapse, unable to accept retreat, unwilling to conduct mobile defense. He ordered cities designated as fortresses to be held regardless of cost or tactical sense. The first fortress had been Stalingrad, where 300,000 German soldiers died or surrendered after Hitler forbade withdrawal. Now, 2 years later, with Germany itself under invasion, Hitler was applying the same failed doctrine to German cities. Aachen was his first test case on German soil. It would prove whether German soldiers and civilians would sacrifice themselves for symbolic resistance, or whether military reality would finally overcome ideological fanaticism. Hitler bet everything on the former. 5,000 German soldiers and 20,000 civilians would pay for that bet. General Friedrich Kling commanded the LXXXXI Corps, responsible for the Aachen sector. A professional soldier, Kling understood that defending Aachen was military madness. The city was nearly surrounded, supplies were limited, reinforcement would be difficult, and the Americans possessed overwhelming firepower. Military logic demanded using Aachen's garrison to defend a line behind the city, trading space for time while preserving combat effectiveness, but Hitler's order forbade logic. On September 17th, Kling received formal written orders designating Aachen a fortress city. He read them twice, then placed them carefully in his desk drawer. His chief of staff stood waiting. "Well?" the chief asked. Kling's expression was carefully neutral. "We will comply," he said. "Inform the commanders." He didn't add what both men understood. They were being ordered to sacrifice 5,000 soldiers for a symbol. Colonel Gerhard Wilk received his appointment as Aachen's commandant on September 20, 1944. 51 years old, a career officer who'd fought in Poland and France, Wilk understood what the appointment meant. Fortress commandants were expected to die with their commands or face execution for failure. Hitler's orders were explicit. Hold until relieved or destroyed. No retreat permitted. Death penalty for any commander who surrendered without permission. Wilk met with his staff that evening, spreading maps across a table in the command bunker beneath Aachen's Farwick Park. "Gentlemen," he said quietly, "we've been handed an impossible mission. We will do it anyway." His officers nodded. They were soldiers. They would follow orders, even orders they knew were suicidal. The garrison Wilk commanded was a mixed force that reflected Germany's desperation. The corps consisted of the 246th Volksgrenadier Division's 246th Infantry Regiment, experienced troops who'd fought on the Eastern Front. Supporting them were SS units, fanatics loyal to Nazi ideology above military sense. Police battalions provided additional manpower, though many were older men with limited combat experience. Scattered Luftwaffe ground units, reassigned from their decimated air force, added to the mix. Finally, the Volkssturm, the people's militia of old men and teenage boys given uniforms and rifles, filled out the numbers. On paper, Wilk commanded 5,000 men. In reality, he commanded perhaps 3,000 effective combat troops and 2,000 poorly trained auxiliaries, who'd break at the first serious pressure. With these forces, he was expected to defend a city against American divisions with unlimited artillery and air support. September 23, 1944. Wilk inspected defensive positions in Aachen's eastern sector. The positions were impressive concrete bunkers, sandbag machine gun nests, interlocking fields of fire, ammunition cached in cellars. But Wilk's practiced I caught the problems. Ammunition stock sufficient for perhaps 2 weeks of heavy fighting. Food for 10 days maximum. Water supply vulnerable to disruption. No reserve forces to counterattack penetrations. Worst of all, the positions were static. Once the Americans broke through, defenders would have nowhere to fall back except other prepared positions that would be equally vulnerable. This wasn't defense, it was delayed annihilation. Every position would be fought over until overrun. Every strong point held until destroyed. Every soldier expected to die, rather than retreat. Medieval siege warfare with modern weapons. The psychological burden on Wilk and his officers was immense. They were professional soldiers trained to evaluate military situations objectively. Every objective analysis concluded defending Aachen was hopeless. The only question was how long they could hold and how many would die in the attempt. But Hitler's order forbade acknowledging this reality. Defeatism was treason, punishable by death. Suggesting tactical withdrawal was cowardice, punishable by death. Even private doubts, if expressed to the wrong person, could result in SS investigation and execution. So, Wilk and his officers maintained the fiction of determined resistance and ultimate German victory, while privately counting ammunition and calculating how many days they could survive. They were trapped between military reality and ideological fantasy, and the only escape was death. September 28, 1944. As American pressure intensified, Wilk drafted a message to Kling requesting permission for tactical adjustment of positions in the city's exposed western sector. He phrased it carefully, avoiding words like withdrawal or retreat, trying to frame the request in terms acceptable to Nazi ideology. The response came within 2 hours. Request denied. All positions will be held. Repeat. All positions will be held. Heil Hitler. Wilk read the message 3 times, then slowly crumpled it. His adjutant watched in silence. "We're going to die here," Wilk said finally. The adjutant had no response. They both knew it was true. The strategic insanity of Hitler's fortress order became apparent when examining Germany's overall situation. The Eastern Front was collapsing with Soviet forces advancing toward Germany's pre-war borders. The Western Front was crumbling as American and British forces pushed deeper. Germany desperately needed mobile reserves to respond to multiple crises simultaneously. Instead, Hitler was tying down 5,000 troops to full regiments in a single surrounded city that offered no strategic advantage. Beyond psychological symbolism, those 5,000 troops could have formed a mobile reaction force conducting delaying actions that traded space for time while preserving combat power. Instead, they would be ground to dust defending rubble, because Hitler couldn't tolerate admitting that retreat was sometimes necessary. Nazi ideology transformed military defeat into moral imperative. To Hitler and his true believers, every meter of ground abandoned was betrayal. Every tactical withdrawal was cowardice. Every acknowledgement of reality was defeatism. This ideology required finding external enemies and internal traitors to explain why Germany was losing. The Jews, the communists, the defeatists, the generals who lacked will. It could never admit that Germany was losing because the regime had started a war. It couldn't win against enemies with superior resources. So, Hitler's orders grew more disconnected from reality, demanding victories where victory was impossible. Forbidding retreats that were militarily necessary, threatening death to anyone who acknowledged obvious truths, and professional soldiers like Wilk, trapped in an authoritarian system where disobedience meant execution, followed those suicidal orders and prepared to die. Aachen would be Hitler's first fortress city test on German soil. It would prove that Nazi fanaticism could force men to fight hopeless battles, but couldn't make those battles any less hopeless. The only question was how high the body count would climb before reality finally triumphed over ideology. September 25, 1944. An American tank depot 3 miles behind the front lines. Sergeant Bill Hutchins stood in a salvage yard surrounded by twisted steel, burned-out vehicles, and the debris of modern warfare. He walked slowly around a damaged Sherman tank, studying the hole punched through its front armor by a German anti-tank round. The hole was clean, perfectly circular, the edges peeled back like flower petals. Inside, dark stains told stories Hutchins didn't want to imagine. He'd lost friends in tanks like this. Good men who'd survived France only to die in the first week of fighting near Aachen. He placed his hand on the cold metal and made a decision. "We're not sending any more boys out there in death traps," he told the engineers gathered around him. "I don't care what regulations say. We're fixing this problem ourselves." The solution Hutchins and his fellow tankers improvised became known as Rhino tanks or assault tanks. Shermans with additional armor welded to their fronts and the sides. The armor came from German Dragon's Teeth obstacles, destroyed pillboxes, salvaged steel plates from bombed buildings, anything they could cut and weld. The modifications were crude, unsanctioned, and absolutely necessary. Standard Sherman's front armor was 2 in thick, adequate against older German guns, but useless against the upgraded weapons American tankers now faced. Adding 3 to 4 in of welded steel didn't make Shermans invulnerable, but it increased crew survival rates enough to matter. The modifications also added 3 to 4 tons of weight, reducing speed and maneuverability, making the tank sluggish and difficult to handle, but tank crews accepted the trade-off gladly. Speed meant nothing if you were dead. September 27, 1944. An infantry company testing new bunker-clearing tactics in a captured German strongpoint. Lieutenant Frank Morrison watched as his flamethrower team approached a concrete pillbox. From its blind side, the thrower's fuel tank strapped to his back, the pilot light flickering at his weapon's muzzle. The flamethrower sent a jet of burning fuel through the pillbox's firing slit, turning the interior into an inferno. Screams came from inside, brief, horrible, then silent. Morrison felt his stomach turn, but forced himself to watch. This was necessary. Standard infantry tactics, rifles and grenades, barely scratched these positions. Artillery could suppress them temporarily, but rarely destroyed them. Flamethrowers worked. They were horrific, nightmare weapons that burned men alive in concrete tombs. But they worked, and working mattered more than Morrison's conscience. The blowtorch and corkscrew tactic emerged from desperate infantry companies, trying to clear fortified buildings without dying in the attempt. Use flamethrowers, bazookas, or tank fire to burn or blast entry points. Corkscrew spiral upward through the building, clearing each floor systematically, throwing grenades up stairwells, shooting through walls, never assuming a room was clear until physically entered and searched. The tactic was slow, exhausting, and terrifying. Soldiers clearing buildings existed in constant fear that the next doorway would conceal an enemy with a machine gun, that the next stairwell would collapse under them, that the next grenade thrown at them would be the one they couldn't avoid. But the tactic reduced casualties compared to simply charging into buildings. It gave infantry a method, a system, something to follow when everything was chaos and violence. Artillery forward observers developed techniques that would have horrified peacetime safety officers, but saved infantry lives. Captain Richard Hayes, attached to the 16th Infantry Regiment, specialized in calling fire danger close artillery strikes within 200 yards of friendly troops, sometimes closer. The margin for error was terrifyingly small. A slight miscalculation, a gun tube worn enough to throw shells off target, a wind shift at the wrong moment. Any of these could drop American artillery on American soldiers. Hayes accepted the risk because the alternative was worse. German positions often sat so close to American lines that conventional artillery support couldn't target them without pulling infantry back, surrendering ground that had cost lives to take. Danger close fire let infantry pin German defenders with their presence, while artillery pulverized positions from above. Hayes called 73 fire missions in October 1944. 3 landed to close, causing friendly casualties. The other 70 destroyed German positions that would have killed far more Americans if left intact. Tank infantry coordination evolved from theoretical doctrine into practical necessity. Before Aachen, tanks and infantry often operated independently or with minimal coordination. Tanks would advance hoping infantry followed. Infantry would attack hoping tanks supported them. This loose cooperation worked adequately in France against mobile German forces. Against Aachen's prepared defenses, it failed catastrophically. Tanks advancing without close infantry support were vulnerable to Panzerforce teams hiding in rubble. Infantry attacking without immediate tank support was slaughtered by machine guns, firing from positions the infantry couldn't suppress. The solution was physical proximity, infantry platoons paired with individual tanks, the tank providing mobile firepower and protection, the infantry protecting the tank from close-range threats and marking targets. They learned to communicate through improvised methods, infantry pointing or kicking the tank hull to indicate targets, tank commanders watching specific infantry squads and responding to their needs. The M12 155mm self-propelled gun found unexpected use as a direct-fire bunker killer. Designed for indirect fire support, lobbing shells at distant targets from protected positions, the M12 became a close-range sledgehammer. Engineers would bring the massive gun within 500 yards of a German bunker, sometimes closer, protected by infantry and smoke. Then the gunner would aim directly at the bunker's firing slit or ventilation opening and fire. A 155mm high-explosive shell hitting a bunker at point-blank range could punch through 3 feet of concrete or, more commonly, crack the structure so badly that subsequent hits collapsed it entirely. The bunker's occupants faced a choice: die in the collapse or abandon the position and face machine gun fire outside. Most chose to die inside. The M12 crews accepted significant risk operating so close to enemy positions, but the weapon's effectiveness justified the danger. October 1st, 1944. A training session behind the lines where infantry replacements learned urban combat techniques. From combat veterans, Sergeant Mike Torres, who'd survived 2 weeks of fighting in Aachen's outskirts, stood before 30 nervous young soldiers. "Everything you learned in basic training will get you killed," he began bluntly. "Forget fire and maneuver. Forget textbook tactics. I'm going to teach you how to survive." He demonstrated how to clear rooms without entering the doorway, bouncing grenades off walls to roll through doors, firing blind around corners, using mirrors to check out obstacles. He showed them how to move through buildings using mouse holes, blasting through walls between rooms rather than using hallways where machine guns waited. He taught them never to assume a position was clear, never to bunch up, never to stand in doorways or windows, never to do anything that made them visible targets for more than seconds. The replacements listened with wide eyes, understanding that they were learning from someone who'd paid for this knowledge in friends' lives. Time on target artillery bombardments, coordinating multiple batteries to impact simultaneously, became standard for major assaults. The technique required precise calculation, each battery at different distances from the target, each gun firing at slightly different times. SO shells arrived together. When executed properly, top bombardments delivered dozens of shells on target within seconds, giving defenders no warning between first impact and total destruction. The psychological effect was devastating. German soldiers learned to endure sequential artillery fire, shells arriving one by one, allowing time to take cover, to endure, to prepare. Top bombardments allowed no such preparation. 1 second, silence. The next second, apocalypse. Survivors described feeling like the world exploded all at once, like being inside a drum beaten by giants. The bombardments weren't always lethal to soldiers in deep bunkers, but they were consistently terrifying, eroding German morale with each coordinated strike. The innovations emerged from necessity, refined through failure, and preserved through survivor testimony. Each technique had been learned the hard way. Soldiers trying something, dying when it failed, succeeding when it worked, teaching survivors what they discovered. This was evolution in real time. Natural selection applied to military tactics. Units that adapted survived. Units that rigidly followed doctrine died. By early October, American forces around Aachen had developed an entirely new tactical system, one specifically designed for urban combat against prepared fortifications. It was brutal, costly, and imperfect, but it was better than what they'd started with in September. The question was whether these hard-won lessons would prove enough against the horrors awaiting them inside Aachen itself, where every building was a fortress and every street a killing ground. The innovations gave them a chance. Whether that chance was sufficient remained to be seen. October 7, 1944, 0500 hours. Colonel John Corley, commanding the 26th Infantry Regiment of the 1st Infantry Division, checked his watch one final time. 30 minutes until the artillery preparation began. 60 minutes until his men attacked toward Selen from the south. Somewhere to the north, the 30th Infantry Division, Old Hickory, was preparing their own assault. If both attacks succeeded, if they could link up east of Aachen near Selen, the German garrison in Aachen would be completely encircled, cut off from supplies, reinforcements, and retreat routes. They'd have two choices: surrender or die. Corley had no illusions about which option the Germans would choose. Hitler's fortress order guaranteed they'd fight to annihilation, but at least encirclement would prevent German reinforcements from reaching the city, and would isolate the battle, allowing American forces to reduce Aachen at their own pace without worrying about relief attempts. The watch hands crawled toward 0530. Corley lifted his radio handset. All units, stand by. The 30th Infantry Division's attack zone lay north of Aachen. Rolling farmland interrupted by villages and industrial works. Major General Leland Hobbs, commanding the division, had chosen to advance with two regiments forward, the 117th and 119th Infantry, keeping the 120th in reserve. His objective was the high ground near Selen, 5 miles northeast of Aachen. Taking that ground would cut the Aachen-Cologne highway, severing the main supply route into the city. Intelligence reported strong German defenses, elements of the 3rd Panzer Grenadier Division, experienced troops with armor support. Hobbs expected fierce resistance. His division had fought in Normandy and across France. They knew how to handle tough fights, but they'd never fought in Germany, never attacked positions defended by soldiers protecting their homeland. October 7th would teach them the difference. 530. October 7th, 1944. 300 American artillery pieces fired simultaneously. The bombardment so intense that earth trembled 4 miles. Shells screamed overhead in a continuous howl, impacting German positions in rolling explosions that merged into continuous thunder. The preparation lasted 30 minutes. 18,000 shells delivered on German defensive lines in half an hour. At 0600, the artillery fire lifted and infantry advanced behind, creeping barrages that walked forward at pre-planned rates. The 30th Division's soldiers moved through smoke and dust, visibility reduced to yards, uncertain what awaited them ahead. Then the German machine guns opened fire. Despite the bombardment, despite the overwhelming firepower, German defenders emerged from bunkers and cellars to man their weapons. The Americans had hoped the artillery would break German resistance. Instead, it had merely announced the attack's beginning. South of Aachen, Corley's 26th Infantry Regiment attacked simultaneously, pushing northeast toward the same objective: link up with the 30th Division, close the ring. His men faced different terrain, more urban, more industrial, more opportunities for German defenders to hide and ambush. But they also faced the same fundamental problem: German soldiers determined to make every yard cost American blood. By mid-morning, October 7th, Corley's lead battalion reported taking heavy casualties from interlocking machine gun positions. By noon, they'd advanced half a mile behind schedule, but moving. The battalion commander requested tank support. Corley approved, knowing tanks would help, but also knowing tanks in urban terrain were vulnerable. Everything was a trade-off. Every decision balanced risk against reward, casualties against objectives. German observation posts on the heights east of Aachen watched the American pincers closing, and understood what was happening. Frantic radio messages flowed to commanders. American infantry advancing from south in battalion strength. American armor observed moving northeast from Eilendorf. Estimated American objective is a Selen link-up. Request permission to fall back to secondary positions. The responses came from Kling's headquarters. No withdrawal permitted. All positions will be held. Counterattacks will destroy American penetrations. But counterattacks required reserves, and reserves were non-existent. The right forces defending outside Aachen were already fully committed. There was nothing left to throw at the American advance except determination and dwindling ammunition. October 16, 1944, 14:30 hours, Ravels Hill near Cellen. Lieutenant Thomas McCall, leading a platoon from the 30th Division's 117th Infantry, reached the crest of a low rise and saw American soldiers approaching from the south. They wore different uniforms, different unit patches. 1st Infantry Division troops from Corley's 26th Infantry. The two forces stared at each other for a frozen moment. Then someone shouted and men rushed forward, shaking hands, slapping backs, passing cigarettes. Officers established radio contact with their respective headquarters. Link-up complete. Aachen is encircled. McCall lit a cigarette, with shaking hands, and looked west toward Aachen, 5 miles distant. Smoke rose from dozens of fires. Artillery rumbled continuously. They'd closed the noose. Now came the hard part, tightening it. The encirclement trapped not just the Aachen garrison, but German forces in surrounding towns and villages. Units that had been defending approaches to Aachen suddenly found themselves cut off, surrounded by American forces that controlled the territory behind them. Some attempted to break out, attacking American lines in desperate night assaults. Most failed. A few succeeded in reaching German lines farther east, bringing with them horrifying reports of American firepower and unbreakable encirclement. The survivors told of comrades left behind, of positions overrun, of ammunition exhausted and relief forces destroyed before reaching these accounts. Spread through German ranks like poison, undermining morale even among troops not yet engaged. October 17, 1944, a German supply column attempted to reach Aachen under cover of darkness. 12 trucks carrying ammunition, medical supplies, food desperately needed inside the city. They moved without lights, drivers navigating by memory and moonlight, hoping to slip through American lines before being detected. American outposts heard the vehicles before seeing them, the distinctive sound of diesel engines, gears grinding, trucks moving slowly on damaged roads. Flares arced into the sky, transforming night into harsh white daylight. Then machine guns and rifle fire erupted from both sides of the road. The trucks were trapped in a kill zone, unable to advance or retreat, taking fire from multiple directions. Some drivers attempted to turn around. Some abandoned vehicles and fled into darkness. Some died at their wheels. By dawn, all 12 trucks sat burning or abandoned, their precious cargo scattered across torn earth. The garrison's radio operator sent a final message. Supply column destroyed. Request alternate route. The response was silence. There was no alternate route. The encirclement was complete. The 3rd Panzer Grenadier Division launched the strongest relief attempt, attacking from the east on October 18th through 20th in a 3-day offensive, designed to break through to Aachen. They had armor support, perhaps 20 tanks, all that could be spared, and orders to reach the city, regardless of cost. The American 30th Division, holding the sector where the Germans attacked, had been warned by intelligence about the coming offensive. They prepared defensive positions, registered artillery on likely German approach routes, and positioned tank destroyer battalions to counter German armor. When the attack came, it was fierce but predictable. German forces achieved initial penetrations, pushing American outposts back, creating small bulges in American lines, but they couldn't sustain momentum. American artillery and air power hammered advancing columns. Tank destroyers picked off German armor from prepared positions. Infantry counterattacks sealed penetrations. By October 21st, the German relief attempt had failed completely, costing the 3rd Panzer Grenadier Division over 1,500 casualties and most of their armor. The Aachen garrison was definitively, irrevocably cut off. Inside Aachen, Wilk received reports of the failed relief attempt with resignation. He'd known relief was unlikely. Now, it was impossible. His garrison was trapped in a dying city defending rubble against enemies who could choose when, and where to attack, while German forces could only react. Supply situation critical. Sufficient for perhaps 1 week of heavy fighting. Food, 10 days at reduced rations. Water, contaminated in many sectors. Supplies dwindling. Medical supplies nearly exhausted. Reinforcements, none possible. Retreat, forbidden. The mathematics were simple and brutal. The only questions were how long they could hold, and how many would die before the end came. Wilk looked at the maps showing American positions surrounding the city. A red ring of enemy forces tightening daily. The noose had closed. Now, it would strangle them slowly, block by block, building by building, until nothing remained but rubble and corpses. He turned to his adjutant. "Update all commanders," he said quietly. "We're on our own." October 11th, 1944, 080 hours, Rotherder District, Eastern Aachen. Sergeant Paul Winters led his squad along a street lined with damaged apartment buildings. Rubble spilling into the road. Morning light filtering through smoke and dust. Everything was quiet, too quiet. Winters had learned in France that quiet meant danger. Enemy waiting, watching, preparing. He hand-signaled his men to spread out, take cover, move slowly. They advanced in textbook formation, each man covering different angles, every few steps pausing to scan windows and doorways. They'd covered maybe 50 yards when the world exploded. Machine gun fire erupted from a second-story window. Muzzle flashes winking in the building's shadow. 3 men dropped before Winters even processed what was happening. The rest dove for cover behind rubble piles, returning fire blindly toward the machine gun position. Bullets sparking off concrete. Private James Murphy had joined Winters' squad 4 days ago. A replacement fresh from training. This was his first combat. He pressed himself against the shattered wall, heart hammering, ears ringing from gunfire, trying to remember training that seemed utterly irrelevant now. Training hadn't prepared him for this. The noise, the confusion, the terror of being shot at by enemies he couldn't see. A bullet cracked past his head, so close he felt the pressure wave. He fired his rifle at nothing in particular, just needing to do something to feel like he wasn't simply waiting to die. Sergeant Winters appeared beside him, grabbing his shoulder. "Save your ammunition," Winters shouted over the gunfire. Short controlled bursts. "Only shoot when you see a target." Murphy nodded, throat too tight to speak, and tried to slow his breathing. Tried to become a soldier instead of a terrified boy. The firefight lasted 17 minutes. It felt like hours. American soldiers maneuvered under covering fire, working around the building's flanks, while others suppressed the machine gun position with overwhelming fire volume. A bazooka team finally got a clear shot, sending a rocket through the window where the machine gun fired. The explosion silenced the weapon. Winters' squad entered the building through a blasted doorway, clearing rooms one by one, finding 2 dead Germans in the machine gun position, and signs that others had fled through rear exits. The cost, 3 Americans dead, 2 wounded, seriously enough to require evacuation. 5 more with minor wounds they'd wrap and ignore. 50 yards gained, 1 building cleared. And this was just 1 squad, 1 firefight. 1 small piece of a battle involving thousands of soldiers across dozens of similar streets. This was urban combat, not dramatic set-piece battles, but grinding repetition of small, vicious fights that individually seemed insignificant, but collectively consumed armies. October 12, 1944, afternoon. Captain Robert Henderson commanded Charlie Company, tasked with clearing a city block in Aachen's residential Eastern District. The block contained approximately 40 buildings, apartments, shops, row houses. Intelligence suggested German defenders held positions throughout the area, but couldn't specify where or in what strength. Henderson's company numbered 130 men at morning roll call. By the time they finished this mission, that number would be lower. He knew it. They knew it. You couldn't clear 40 buildings defended by determined enemies without casualties. The only question was how many. Henderson split his company into 3 platoons, each responsible for clearing specific buildings. They would advance building by building, supporting each other with covering fire, requesting tank support when encountering strong resistance. Simple plan, brutal execution. The technique for clearing a defended building had evolved through trial and error, written in blood by soldiers who'd learned what worked and what got you killed. First, reconnaissance by fire. Shoot into windows, doorways, any potential fighting position, forcing defenders to reveal themselves or take cover. Second, breach. Use explosives, tanks, or simply shooting the door hinges to create entry points. Third, assault. Throw grenades into the breach, then follow immediately before defenders recover. Fourth, clear. Move room to room, floor to floor, checking every possible hiding place, assuming nothing until verified. Each step had to be done right, or men died. Skip reconnaissance. Walk into ambush. Breach wrong. Entry team gets slaughtered. Hesitate after grenades. Defenders shoot you in the doorway. Rush the clearing. Miss a defender who shoots you in the back. There was no safety, only procedures that reduced the chances of dying. Private First Class Tony Romano crouched in a basement with his squad, preparing to assault the building above them. They'd entered through a cellar window, finding the basement empty and using it as shelter while preparing their next move. Romano's hands shook as he pulled the pin from a grenade. He was supposed to throw it up the stairwell, then follow with his squad to clear the ground floor. Simple. Except nothing was simple when people were trying to kill you. His sergeant nodded. Romano threw the grenade up the stairs, heard it clatter on floor above, then explode with a dull thud. He charged up the stairs with his squad, emerging into smoke-filled hallway, rifle up, looking for targets. A door to his left flew open and a German soldier appeared, equally surprised, both men bringing weapons up simultaneously. Romano fired first, pure reflex, no thought, the rifle bucking in his hands. The German fell. Romano stared for a frozen second, then his sergeant shoved him forward. Keep moving, check the rooms. By evening, October 12th, Charlie Company had cleared 21 of 40 buildings in their assigned block. Cost 8 killed, 19 wounded, 47 showing signs of combat exhaustion. They'd killed an estimated 30 Germans and captured 12, though exact counts were impossible. Some defenders escaped through cellars and roof lines. Some bodies were buried in collapsed buildings. Henderson radioed battalion, requesting permission to halt for the night, allow his men to rest, bring up supplies and replacements. Permission granted. His men established defensive positions in cleared buildings, posted sentries, tried to sleep in rooms that smelled of cadites and death. Some managed a few hours rest, others lay awake, staring at darkness, replaying the day's violence, wondering if tomorrow would be the day they died. This was one company, one block, one day. Multiply that across the entire city, across weeks of fighting, and you begin to understand why Aachen broke men as thoroughly as it broke buildings. October 13th, 1944, morning. Battalion Medical Officer Captain David Goldman processed an unusual number of what the men called Section 8 cases. Soldiers too psychologically shattered to continue fighting. Some couldn't stop trembling. Some couldn't speak, mouths opening soundlessly when asked questions. One soldier sat rocking back and forth, humming tunelessly, eyes focused on something invisible. Another startled at every sound, grabbing his rifle reflexively, finger tightening on the trigger until medics wrestled the weapon away. Combat exhaustion was the official term, though that sanitized phrase didn't capture what Goldman witnessed. Human minds breaking under stress they weren't designed to endure. The close quarters violence, the constant danger, the bodies, the screams, the knowledge that any door might conceal death. It accumulated, grinding men down until something essential snapped. Goldman processed 37 combat exhaustion cases in October 1944. That number would climb to over 200 by battle's end, matching the rate of physical wounds. Night fighting was particularly horrific. Darkness reduced visibility to feet, turned every sound into potential threat, made distinguishing friend from enemy nearly impossible. German defenders used darkness to their advantage, infiltrating American positions, attacking from unexpected directions, creating chaos that multiplied the Americans' numerical advantage worthless. American soldiers learned to fear nightfall, knowing darkness would bring probing attacks, snipers, patrols attempting to locate positions. They slept in shifts if they slept at all, one man always on watch, everyone keeping weapons within reach. Sometimes they heard wounded crying in darkness between positions men hit during the day's fighting, lying in no man's land, pleading for help neither side could provide without exposing themselves to fire. The cries would last 4 hours sometimes, growing weaker, finally stopping. Those sounds haunted veterans decades later. The memory of hearing someone die slowly while being unable to help, unwilling to risk their own death for someone already beyond saving. The casualty pattern revealed the intimacy of urban combat. In France, most casualties came from artillery shells exploding at distance, impersonal and random. In Aachen, 60% of casualties came from small arms and grenades, weapons used at ranges where you saw the enemy's face, where killing was personal and deliberate. Soldiers shot other soldiers from 10 feet away. They threw grenades into rooms occupied by enemies they'd heard breathing. They cleared buildings where blood pooled on floors and wounded men screamed in languages they didn't understand. This wasn't industrial warfare. It was close-quarters butchery, dressed in military terminology. And the psychological cost of that intimacy would echo for lifetimes, in nightmares and therapy sessions and conversations with people who could never understand what it meant to kill someone close enough to smell their sweat, to watch the light leave their eyes, to step over their body and keep fighting because that's what soldiers did. By October 15th, American forces had penetrated perhaps 1 mile into Aachen's eastern districts. That mile had cost 750 casualties and 2 weeks of continuous fighting. Officers calculated that clearing the entire city at this rate would require 6 to 8 more weeks, and 3,000 to 4,000 more casualties. The mathematics were brutal but inescapable. You couldn't rush urban combat. Trying to move too fast got everyone killed. You couldn't bypass strong points. Leaving enemies behind your lines meant being shot in the back. You could only grind forward, building by building, room by room, accepting that each structure cleared cost blood and time. The meat grinder devoured soldiers with mechanical efficiency, caring nothing for courage or tactics or justice. It simply consumed everyone who entered, Americans, Germans, civilians caught between. And the only question was whether enough Americans would survive to see the cities fall. The grinding would continue until one side or the other ran out of bodies to feed into the machine. October 12, 1944, 1400 hours. A German defensive position in Aachen's eastern sector. Unteroffizier Sergeant Kurt Schaefer watched American soldiers advancing down the street 300 meters away, their cautious movements suggesting they expected ambush. Schaefer's 5-man machine gun team occupied a reinforced position on the 2nd floor of an apartment building, sandbags protecting their position, firing lanes cleared through rubble, ammunition stacked in wooden crates within easy reach. Schaefer had fought on the Eastern Front, survived battles that made this feel almost manageable. He knew what American firepower could do. He'd seen it destroy entire companies when defenders made mistakes. The key was patience. Let them close, wait for the perfect moment, then hit them hard before they located your position. Beside him, 17-year-old Volkssturm soldier Werner Klein gripped his rifle with white-knuckle tension. "Relax," Schaefer told the boy quietly. "Wait for my signal. Watch and learn." Klein had received his uniform and rifle 4 weeks ago, given 3 days of training, then assigned to Schaefer's squad as reinforcement. He was soft, terrified, utterly unprepared for combat. Schaefer recognized the type boys who should be in school, drafted because Germany was running out of soldiers, given weapons they barely knew how to operate, and told they were defending the fatherland. Klein would probably die within days. Most of the Volkssturm did. They weren't soldiers. They were sacrifices offered to Nazi ideology's insatiable appetite. But for now, Klein was Schaefer's responsibility, and Schaefer would try to keep him alive as long as possible. "When I fire," Schaefer instructed, "aim at the soldiers who dive for cover. They'll be stationary for a few seconds while figuring out where we're shooting from. That's your opportunity." Klein nodded, too frightened to speak. The American squad reached the distance Schaefer had pre-registered, 220 meters. White mark painted on the wall for reference. He opened fire, the MG-42 machine gun hammering out rounds at 1,200 per minute. The sound that Americans called Hitler's buzzsaw for its distinctive ripping noise. Tracer rounds flashed downrange, impacting around American soldiers who scattered for cover. Klein fired his rifle in jerky, panicked shots that probably hit nothing. The other team members contributed supporting fire with rifles and a Panzerfaust anti-tank weapon aimed at buildings where Americans might take cover. The firefight lasted perhaps 90 seconds before Schaefer ceased fire. "Pack up. Move," he ordered his team. They grabbed essential equipment, machine gun, ammunition, weapons, and retreated through the building's rear exit into cellars that connected to other structures. Within 3 minutes of opening fire, they'd relocated to buildings away, establishing a new position while Americans called artillery on their previous location. This was Schaefer's fourth defensive position in 6 days. The pattern was always the same: establish position, engage Americans, inflict casualties, withdraw before being overwhelmed or destroyed by American firepower. The tactics worked. They were still alive, still fighting, but they couldn't win. Every engagement reduced ammunition stocks, thinned their numbers, pushed them deeper into the city. There was no reinforcement, no resupply, no relief. They were defending not to victory but to delay, making Americans pay in blood and time for every meter of ground. Schaefer understood this without anyone explaining it. You didn't survive the Eastern Front without learning to recognize hopeless situations. The only question was whether he'd survive long enough to surrender when the inevitable end came, or whether he'd die beforehand in some random engagement no one would remember. October 14th, 1944, evening. Wilkes command bunker beneath Farwick Park. Colonel Wilkes studied casualty reports with growing alarm. His garrison had begun with approximately 5,000 soldiers. After just 1 week of serious fighting, he'd lost at least 1,500 killed, wounded, captured, or missing. Ammunition was down to 50% capacity, food stocks sufficient for perhaps 8 more days. Water contamination growing worse daily. And the Americans hadn't even attempted a major assault yet. Everything so far had been probing attacks, feeling out defenses, testing strength. When the real offensive came, his garrison would crumble in days. Wilkes knew this. His staff knew this. But Nazi ideology forbade acknowledging reality, so they maintained the fiction of determined resistance. Wilkes drafted a situation report for Cushing, carefully phrased to sound determined, while conveying the desperate situation. Garrison continues vigorous defense despite heavy pressure. Casualties and supply situation require attention. Current stocks adequate for continued operations. Translation: we're dying and running out of everything, but orders forbid saying so directly. The SS units defending Aachen provided fanatical resistance and caused everyone else enormous problems, while Wehrmacht soldiers like Schaefer fought professionally, using tactics designed to maximize enemy casualties while preserving their own forces. The SS fought with ideological fury that bordered on suicidal. They refused to withdraw from untenable positions, held strong points until wiped out, shot soldiers who suggested tactical retreats. An SS Hauptsturmführer, captain named Klaus Brecht, commanded a company defending the city's northern sector. Brecht had been Nazi Party member since 1936, true believer in Hitler's vision of Germanic supremacy and Lebensraum expansion. When American forces overran one of his platoon positions on October 13th, Brecht personally executed the platoon leader for defeatism. Despite the man having fought until wounded and out of ammunition, Brecht's company fought with desperate intensity, inflicting heavy American casualties. They also died in disproportionate numbers because Brecht's tactics, never retreat, fight to annihilation, guaranteed destruction. October 15, 1944, noon. A German medical station in a cellar beneath Aachen City Hall. Dr. Heinrich Müller worked by lamplight, surgical instruments spread on a blood-stained table. Wounded soldiers lying on every available surface. Greater than snorts, greater than Müller had run out of morphine 3 days ago. He'd run out of proper antiseptics 2 days ago. He now operated without anesthesia, using whatever he could find to clean wounds. Vodka scavenged from abandoned bars, sometimes just boiled water. The wounded screamed during procedures, sound that haunted Müller's sleep when he managed to sleep at all. A soldier was brought in with shrapnel wounds across his back and legs. Müller examined the wounds, calculating operating required time and supplies he didn't have. The soldier would probably die from infection even if Müller operated successfully. Give him water, Müller told his assistant. Make him comfortable. The soldier stared at Müller with understanding in his eyes. He knew what make him comfortable meant. He was being triaged, left to die so supplies could be used on soldiers more likely to survive. Müller moved to the next patient, bearing his guilt and horror beneath professional detachment. The garrison's composition created tension and inefficiency. Regular Wehrmacht troops despised the SS for their brutality and fanaticism. The SS distrusted Wehrmacht soldiers as potentially disloyal to Nazi ideology. Volkssturm troops were dismissed by both groups as useless amateurs. Police units existed in awkward middle ground, neither fully military nor clearly SS affiliated. Luftwaffe ground troops resented being forced into infantry roles, for which they had minimal training. These divisions might have been manageable in normal circumstances, but under siege, under constant pressure, they festered into dangerous resentments. Arguments broke out over ammunition distribution, defensive positions, tactical decisions. Officers spent time mediating disputes that should have been spent coordinating defense. The garrison wasn't a unified force, but a collection of factions forced together by circumstance and Hitler's orders, barely cooperating even while facing common enemy. October 18, 1944, night. Schwer's squad occupied positions in a bombed-out factory, waiting for American night patrols. They knew would come. Werner Klein sat against a wall, rifle across his lap, crying silently. Schwer noticed but said nothing. Let the boy cry. Better to release fear now than freeze when fighting started. Another soldier, Corporal Fritz Hahn, cleaned his rifle with obsessive precision, hands moving automatically through motions performed thousands of times. Hahn had stopped talking 3 days ago, communicating only through nods and gestures. Shell shock, Americans called it. Whatever the term, Hahn was finished as a soldier. He'd fight because refusing meant execution. But his mind had departed to somewhere safer than war-torn Aachen. Private Max Vogel wrote a letter to his wife by candlelight, knowing the letter would never be mailed, but writing anyway because they maintained sanity. These were the defenders holding Aachen exhausted, terrified, many broken psychologically, all knowing they were dying by degrees. Yet they continued fighting because alternatives execution for desertion. American captivity with its uncertain fate seemed worse than continuing the familiar horror of combat. Motivation among defenders varied wildly. Some SS troops genuinely believed in Nazi ideology, fought because they considered themselves warriors defending civilization against subhuman enemies. The deranged racial ideology that Hitler had pumped into German consciousness for 12 years. Most Wehrmacht soldiers fought from more pragmatic calculation. Surrender might mean death, from SS execution squads. Better to fight and hope for survival. Many fought simply because they were soldiers, and soldiers followed orders. Even orders they privately considered suicidal. A few fought from genuine patriotism, defending Germany itself rather than Nazi regime. Unable to separate nation from ideology, and some growing numbers, as the battle wore on, fought only because American firepower made surrender too dangerous to attempt. Trying to surrender in close quarters urban combat often got you killed. Before anyone recognized the white flag, October 20th, 1944, morning, Schwer's team received orders to abandon their factory position and fall back to prepared positions, closer to city center. The withdrawal was tactical admission that eastern defenses were collapsing, that Americans had penetrated too deeply to hold the outer districts. Schwer's squad moved through cellars and ruins, staying below ground when possible. Covering 300 meters in nearly 2 hours of cautious movement, they passed destroyed positions, bodies that hadn't been recovered, equipment abandoned when positions fell. Klein vomited twice during the withdrawal, overcome by sights and smells. Vogel moved mechanically, face blank. Hahn followed like a ghost, silent and empty. Schwer kept them moving, kept them together, knowing that stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant understanding the hopelessness of their situation. Better to keep moving, keep fighting, keep existing moment to moment without considering past or future. That's how you survived, by shrinking your world to the immediate present, to this task, this position, this hour. Tomorrow didn't exist. Yesterday didn't matter. Only now was real. And now required moving backward, defending less, surviving longer against enemies who grew stronger daily. The indefensible was being defended, but the defense was failing 1 meter, 1 position, 1 soldier at a time. October 13th, 1944, 0600 hours. Captain William Bradford gathered his company officers on a map, spread on the hood of a battler jeep. The map showed one city block in Aachen's Adalbertstrasse sector, approximately 250 meters long, 150 meters wide, containing roughly 60 individual structures. Bradford's Charlie Company had been tasked with clearing this block completely. A mission intelligence estimated would take 12 to 18 hours. Bradford looked at his officers, 3 lieutenants, younger than him, but aged beyond their years by months of combat, and saw skepticism in their eyes. They'd learned that intelligence estimates were usually optimistic. 60 buildings, Bradford said quietly, all potentially occupied, all potentially fortified. We'll take it building by building, no rushing, proper clearing procedures. Questions? One lieutenant raised his hand. What's our casualty estimate, sir? Bradford hesitated, then answered honestly. 10 to 15%, maybe 20 if we're unlucky. The assault plan divided the block into 3 sectors, 1 for each platoon. First platoon would clear the northern row of buildings, advancing west to east. Second platoon took the southern row, also west to east. Third platoon remained in reserve, ready to reinforce whichever platoon encountered strongest resistance, or support breakthrough opportunities if defenses collapsed. Tank support, 1 Sherman per platoon, would provide direct fire against identified strongpoints, but couldn't navigate the rubble-choked streets, forcing them to operate from block perimeter. Artillery support was pre-registered on specific targets. The large factory building at the block center, several commercial structures that looked like obvious defensive positions, the apartment building on the southeast corner. Bradford synchronized watches with his platoon leaders. Artillery prep at 0645, infantry moves at 0700. By this time tomorrow, this block belongs to us. 645, October 13th, the artillery barrage began. 12 guns firing for 15 minutes, 180 shells crashing into the city block in coordinated destruction. Buildings collapsed or caught fire. Smoke and dust rose in choking clouds. The noise was overwhelming. Physical pressure that compressed air and rattled bones, and Bradford watched through binoculars, from a position 200 meters away, seeing walls topple, roofs cave in, fires spreading. When the barrage lifted at 0700, silence felt unnatural, ears still ringing, expecting the next explosion. All units, Bradford spoke into his radio, commence assault. First platoon, led by Lieutenant Robert Hayes, entered the block from the northwest corner. Hayes had divided his 36 men into 3 squads, each squad responsible for clearing specific buildings. Squad 1 took point, approaching the first structure, a 3-story apartment building with blown-out windows and partial roof collapse. Standard procedure, reconnaissance by fire. The squad peppered the building with rifle and bar fire for 30 seconds, watching for return fire or movement. Nothing. They advanced to the building's entrance, a sergeant tossing a grenade through the doorway, waiting for the explosion, then leading his team inside. Room clearing. Kick door or shoot hinges. Toss grenade. Enter immediately after explosion. Shoot anything moving. They found the ground floor empty, except for furniture and debris. The stairwell to upper floors had partially collapsed. The squad leader radioed. Building 1 clear. Moving to Building 2. Building 2 was a row house, narrower but deeper than Building 1. The front door was barricaded from inside. Squad 2's corporal placed a satchel charge against the door, everyone taking cover. The explosion blowing the barricade apart. The squad entered fast, clearing the entry hall, pushing into rooms on either side. A German soldier appeared in a doorway, rifle rising. 3 Americans fired simultaneously. The German fell. They found 2 more German soldiers in the cellar, hands raised in surrender. No will to fight remaining. The prisoners were zip-tied and sent to the rear under guard. Squad 2 continued clearing the building, finding fighting positions that had been prepared but abandoned. Sandbags, ammunition caches, firing slits cut through walls. Intelligence. Germans had planned to defend here, but withdrew rather than being trapped. Building 2 cleared. Time elapsed, 37 minutes for 2 buildings, 58 to go. By noon, October 13th, 1st Platoon had cleared 9 buildings at a cost of 2 men killed and 5 wounded. Progress was slowing. Defenders in depth of the block were fighting harder. Resistance stiffening as Americans advanced. 2nd Platoon reported similar pace. 11 buildings cleared, 4 casualties. 3rd Platoon had been committed to support 1st Platoon, after they encountered a strong German position in a fortified factory building. The factory was the block's central structure. 3 stories of brick and concrete converted into a miniature fortress. Machine guns fired from multiple windows. Interlocking fields of fire covering approaches from 3 directions. Hayes requested tank support. As Sherman maneuvered to position where it could fire on the factory, then pumped 6 75mm high-explosive rounds through the ground floor wall, creating a massive breach. Infantry followed, throwing white phosphorus grenades through the breach. Fire and smoke forcing defenders to upper floors. The factory was a maze, rooms connected by corridors, stairwells blocked, positions prepared on multiple levels. Clearing it required 2 hours of room-by-room fighting. Ammunition expenditure revealed urban combat's resource intensity. In France, riflemen typically fired 20 to 30 rounds per day of combat. In Aachen, they fired 200 rounds or more. Every potential position required suppressive fire. Every window needed to be shot at. Every room got grenade and rifle fire before entry. Machine gunners burned through belts at rates that would have horrified supply officers. 1 bar gunner fired 430 rounds during the factory assault, nearly his entire basic load, requiring immediate resupply. Grenade consumption was equally intense. Average 40 grenades per squad per building cleared. Multiply this across 60 buildings and you understand why ammunition supply became critical constraint. Bradford had supply parties running constantly, bringing forward ammunition from battalion stocks, distributing to platoons based on their consumption rates and expected further fighting. October 14th, 030 hours, 33 hours after assault began. 1st Platoon occupied cleared buildings in the block's northern sector, establishing defensive positions, rotating soldiers through sleep shifts. Hayes had started with 36 men. He now had 28 effectives, 3 killed, 5 wounded seriously enough for evacuation, 3 walking wounded who refused evacuation. plus Hayes himself with a bandaged arm from shrapnel he barely remembered receiving. His platoon had cleared 23 buildings. Second platoon had cleared 19 buildings and third platoon another 12. Total 54 of 60 buildings. 6 buildings remained, all in the block's southeast corner, all apparently strongly defended. American casualties for the block: 7 killed, 23 wounded. Several dozen minor injuries treated in place. German casualties: estimated 40 dead, 15 captured. A known number escaped through cellars to adjacent blocks. The mathematics was slightly better than Bradford's pre-assault estimates, but slightly better still meant young men dead or maimed for 250 meters of destroyed real estate. The final 6 buildings required another 12 hours. Defenders fought with desperation born from being cornered, knowing retreat was impossible, surrender dangerous. One building required engineers to demolish an exterior wall with explosives before infantry could enter. Another building's defenders fought to annihilation. 15 German soldiers dying rather than surrendering, taking to American lives with them. The last building held only terrified civilians, 3 families huddled in a cellar, who emerged with hands raised, babbling in German, pleading not to be shot. Bradford personally ensured they were safely evacuated, gave them water and rations, arranged transport to civilian collection points. One elderly woman kissed his hand sobbing. Bradford felt sick. This was Victory 1. City block taken. 7 Americans dead. An unknown number of German soldiers and civilians killed or displaced. 60 buildings reduced to rubble. Multiply this block by the hundreds needed to clear the entire city, and you understood why Aachen broke everyone it touched. October 15th, 1944, 1400 hours. Bradford's after-action report documented lessons learned, tactics refined, costs assessed. Time required: 47 hours from assault commencement to final building cleared. Casualties: 7 killed, 23 evacuated wounded, 18 minor wounds. Enemy casualties: estimated 45 killed, 15 captured. Buildings cleared: 60. Ammunition expended: 37,000 rifle rounds, 5,000 machine gun rounds, 340 grenades, 72 anti-tank rockets, 41 demolition charges. Artillery support: 215 shells delivered. Tank support: 63 main gun rounds. Recommendations: increase ammunition allocation per company for urban operations. Attach engineer squads permanently to infantry companies. Rotate units more frequently to prevent combat exhaustion. The report was clinical, professional, written in military language that drained all emotion from described events. It didn't mention the sounds of wounded screaming, the smell of burning bodies, the sight of civilians emerging from cellars like corpses risen from graves. Those details didn't fit in after-action reports, but they lived in memories of everyone who'd been there, would live there for decades, surfacing in nightmares and moments of silence. 1 city block, 47 hours, 7 American lives, and hundreds more blocks remained before Aachen would fall. October 14th, 1944, 1100 hours, Eastern Aachen. Private Daniel O'Connor crouched behind rubble, rifle aimed at a third-story window of an apartment building 200 yards ahead. His squad leader had identified the building as a German position. Someone had seen movement in that window 30 minutes ago. Standard procedure: suppress the position with rifle fire, then assault. But O'Connor had also seen something in that window, something that made his finger freeze on the trigger. Children's toys. A stuffed bear visible on the windowsill, colorful blocks scattered on the floor inside. Maybe the toys had been there before the war, abandoned when residents fled. Or maybe the thought made his stomach clench. Maybe children were in that building right now, huddled in terror while soldiers fought around them. His squad leader noticed his hesitation. O'Connor, what the hell? Fire on that position. O'Connor's hands shook. Sarge, I think there might be German machine gun fire erupted from that exact window. Cutting off his words, bullets cracking past their position. The squad leader's voice turned hard. Suppressive fire now. That's an order. The moral calculation happened in seconds. O'Connor could refuse to fire, risk court-martial for disobeying orders in combat, possibly let his squadmates die because he wouldn't provide covering fire. Or he could fire on a building that might contain children, become someone who killed innocents, carry that weight forever. There was no good choice, only terrible options measured against each other in moments of stress and fear. O'Connor fired. His bullets joined dozens of others punching through the building's facade, shattering windows, hitting stone and wood and flesh indiscriminately. The German machine gun fell silent. Whether his bullets killed the German gunner or someone else, whether anyone innocent died in that fusillade, O'Connor would never know. But the uncertainty was its own torture. The possibility that he'd killed children haunted him more than the certainty would have. At least certainty provided closure. Uncertainty festered like an infected wound, poisoning every memory of that moment. October 15th, 1944, afternoon, an American aid station. Corporal James Mitchell helped carry a wounded German soldier into the medical tent, laying him on a blood-stained stretcher. The German was young, maybe 19, got shot and pale with shock. Babbling in German that no one understood, Captain Goldman, the battalion surgeon, began assessing the wound, while Mitchell stood by to assist. Goldman's hands moved efficiently, but Mitchell saw the calculation in his eyes. This wound was bad, requiring surgery they couldn't perform at battalion level. Evacuation to field hospital necessary for any survival chance. But evacuation spots were limited, already full of wounded Americans. The unspoken triage question hung in the air. Did we use precious resources to save an enemy soldier? Goldman caught Mitchell's eye, seeing his own conflict reflected there. Then Goldman began preparing the German for evacuation. Get him stabilized, Goldman told Mitchell. He goes with the next ambulance. Mitchell nodded, feeling relief and guilt simultaneously. Relief that his commander had chosen mercy. Guilt that he doubted whether mercy was justified. The scene repeated an hour later with a twist that made Mitchell's relief curdle into something darker. Another wounded German arrived. This one also got shot, but with better vitals, better survival chances. An American soldier with shrapnel wounds to both legs lay nearby, painful but not life-threatening. The next ambulance had to evacuation spots. Goldman sent both German soldiers, keeping the wounded American at the aid station for later evacuation. The American soldier protested weakly. "Doc, why are you sending them when I'm hurt?" Goldman's expression was carefully neutral. "They'll die without immediate surgery. You'll survive until the next transport. That's how triage works." After the ambulance left, Mitchell approached Goldman. "Sir, the men are asking why we're prioritizing enemy wounded." Goldman looked exhausted. "We're not prioritizing. We're treating based on medical need, regardless of uniform. That's our duty. That's what separates us from them." Mitchell wanted to believe that, needed to believe that. But he'd seen the looks on American soldiers' faces, the resentment, the sense of betrayal. Mercy had costs beyond the medical. October 16th, 1944, evening. An American chaplain conducted field service in a damaged church. Father Thomas Murphy stood before 30 soldiers, Bible open, trying to find words that addressed what these men had experienced, and would experience again tomorrow. "We fight a righteous war," he began, then paused. The words felt hollow. He tried again. "We fight against evil, against tyranny, against Aachen." He stopped seeing their faces. These weren't men questioning the war's righteousness. They were men who'd done things that tormented them, who'd killed enemies and possibly innocents, who'd watched friends die, who'd lost pieces of their humanity in rooms and streets that smelled of death. Righteous war rhetoric didn't address their pain. Murphy closed his Bible. "I don't have answers," he said quietly. "I don't know how to make sense of what we're doing, what we're becoming. I can only offer you this. God sees your burden. He understands that sometimes there are no good choices, only less terrible ones. What you carry, you don't carry alone." Several soldiers wept openly. Murphy felt his own eyes burning. This was his ministry now, not salvation rhetoric but acknowledgement of suffering, bearing witness to men bearing unbearable things. Company Commander Captain Richard Hayes wrote a letter home on October 17th, then burned it before sending. The letter described what he couldn't put in official reports: the bodies of civilians mixed with soldiers in rubble, the sound of children crying in cellars, the choices made in seconds that would echo for lifetimes. "We're destroying this city to save it," he'd written. "We're killing people to liberate them. I don't know anymore if we're heroes or monsters. Maybe we're both. Maybe war makes everyone monsters and calls it necessary." Hayes watched the letter burn, understanding he could never send such words home. His family needed to believe he was fighting a clean war, defending freedom, coming home whole. They couldn't know that pieces of him were dying in Aachen's ruins, that the man who eventually returned wouldn't be the man who'd left. So he wrote a different letter, carefully cheerful, mentioning the weather and food and about his sister's new baby. The truth stayed buried, another casualty of urban warfare. Intelligence officer Lieutenant David Klein interrogated a captured German soldier on October 18th, a teenager named Hans, who couldn't be older than 17. Hans had been conscripted 3 months ago, given minimal training, sent to Aachen's defense. He'd fired his rifle exactly once before, surrendering shot blindly at movement, had no idea if he hit anything, then hid in a cellar until Americans found him. Now he sat across from Klein, terrified, expecting execution. "How old are you?" Klein asked in German. 17, sir." Klein felt sick. "Do you have family?" "Mother and 2 sisters in Munich, sir. Father died in Russia." Klein recorded the information mechanically, already knowing this boy would go to prisoner camp, probably survive the war, probably carry trauma from these days for the rest of his life. Klein had thought about his own nephew, 16 years old, back in Brooklyn. Similar age, radically different circumstances. One playing baseball after school. One sitting in a cellar waiting to die because Nazi fanaticism demanded it. What do you do with that? How do you reconcile that this terrified child is technically your enemy? That if circumstances were slightly different, he might have killed you or your friends? Klein processed the paperwork, sending Hans to prisoner collection point, then stepped outside and vomited. October 19th, 1944, morning briefing. Major General Clarence Hubler, commanding the 1st Infantry Division, addressed his battalion commanders about civilian casualties. Reports had reached division headquarters about increasing civilian deaths, about bodies found in cellars of cleared buildings, about refugees shot trying to cross battle lines. Hubler was blunt. "Gentlemen, we're here to destroy German military capability, not slaughter civilians. I understand combat conditions make discrimination difficult. I understand split-second decisions under fire. But we're Americans. We're better than the enemy. Every civilian death is a propaganda victory for Goebbels and a stain on our honor. Make it clear to your men. Civilians are to be protected when possible, treated humanely, always, and never deliberately harmed." The commanders nodded, but several exchanged skeptical glances. Hubler's orders were morally correct and practically impossible. How do you distinguish civilian from soldier when both hide in cellars? How do you protect civilians without exposing your own men to additional risk? How do you bomb a city into submission while preserving the people inside it? These were questions with no good answers. Only desperate compromises between competing moral demands. The psychological toll of moral ambiguity showed in different ways. Some soldiers became harder, suppressing empathy as weakness, treating everyone as enemies until proven otherwise. They stopped seeing faces, stopped hearing pleas, stopped feeling guilt because feeling meant drowning in an ocean of horror they couldn't survive. Others became increasingly unstable, breaking down during combat or after, unable to reconcile their actions with their conscience. They'd sit 4 hours staring at nothing or suddenly weep or explode in rage at minor provocations. A few became almost reckless, taking unnecessary risks, perhaps unconsciously seeking death as escape from moral burden. and most existed somewhere between these extremes, learning to compartmentalize, to separate the person who fought from the person who would someday go home, hoping those two selves could eventually reunite without destroying each other. Medic Thomas Rodriguez treated wounded on both sides throughout October, watching men die regardless of uniform. One evening, October 20th, he sat exhausted in an aid station corner, surrounded by groaning wounded, and tried to remember why distinctions between American and German mattered. They all bled the same color. They all screamed in pain, using the same vocal cords. They all died calling for mothers or wives or gods who didn't answer. The uniforms seemed arbitrary, meaningless markers that determined who received treatment first but didn't change the fundamental sameness of human suffering. Rodriguez knew this thinking was dangerous. You had to maintain distinctions, had to remember which side you fought for, had to believe your cause was righteous even when methods were brutal. But late at night, surrounded by wounded who might die regardless of his efforts, the distinctions blurred and he saw only human beings destroying each other over conflicts they didn't create, following orders they couldn't refuse, dying for reasons that seemed increasingly abstract. He stood up, forced himself to focus, returned to treating the wounded. The work was tangible, the moral questions were not. So he worked and tried not to think. The moral weight of Aachen would follow soldiers home, manifest in nightmares and therapy sessions and moments of unexpected breakdown decades later. They would remember faces of enemies they'd killed, wonder about those enemies' families, question whether each death had been necessary or just convenient. They would remember civilian bodies and wonder if those people had been given fair warning, adequate time to evacuate, any choice at all. They would remember orders followed and orders questioned and orders that maybe should have been refused. The victory they earned in Aachen came wrapped in moral ambiguity that no parade or medal could resolve. They'd done what war demanded, killed enemies, destroyed positions, accomplished missions, but they'd also done what humanity condemned, killed innocents, destroyed homes, created suffering that rippled outward through families and communities. Holding both truths simultaneously was the burden veterans carried, the weight that made victory heavy instead of triumphant, the knowledge that sometimes winning requires becoming something you'd never wanted to be. October 16th, 1944, 2,200 hours. Colonel Gerhard Wilkes' command bunker beneath Farwick Park. Wilkes sat alone at a steel desk, studying casualty reports by lamplight that flickered with each distant explosion. The numbers told a story his staff couldn't and his superiors wouldn't acknowledge. His garrison was dying. Started with 5,000 soldiers, now down to approximately 2,800 effective combatants. Ammunition stocks at 30% capacity, food for perhaps 6 more days. Water contaminated in most sectors. Medical supplies exhausted 3 days ago. The Americans had completed encirclement, cutting all supply routes, making resupply impossible and reinforcement unthinkable. Elementary military mathematics concluded this defense was finished. The only question was whether Wilkes would acknowledge reality and save his remaining men, or follow Hitler's orders and watch them die for a symbol. Wilkes rubbed his eyes, feeling the weight of command crushing him, and reached for paper to draft a message he knew he couldn't send. The message began: request permission for tactical withdrawal of garrison to secondary defensive positions east of city. Current positions untenable. Further resistance will result in total destruction of forces without corresponding military benefit. Wilkes wrote 3 paragraphs carefully, arguing that preserving combat capability served Germany's interests better than sacrificing these troops for Aachen's rubble. He detailed casualty rates, supply status, enemy strength, tactical realities. The argument was sound, professional, exactly what his training and experience dictated. He read it twice, then slowly crumpled the paper. Even asking for withdrawal was treason under Hitler's fortress doctrine. Koechlin would be required to report such defeatism to higher headquarters. SS investigators would arrive. Wilkes would face court-martial and execution, his family dishonored. his name erased from German military honor rolls, and the garrison would still be ordered to die in place. So, Wilk burned the unsent message and drafted another. Garrison continues determined resistance. Morale remains high despite pressure. Confident of holding assigned positions. Heil Hitler. The lies tasted like ash, but survival sometimes required lying to superiors, to subordinates, to yourself. October 18, 1944, morning. Wilk met with his senior officers in the command bunker, full regimental commanders, his chief of staff, his operations officer. Maps covered the table showing American penetrations. Eastern sector collapsing, northern sector under severe pressure, southern sector barely holding. Red arrows marked American advances. Blue symbols showed dwindling German positions. The operations officer briefed situation with clinical precision. Enemy has penetrated approximately 1.5 kilometers into eastern districts. Northern defenses withdrawn to secondary positions after suffering 40% casualties. Southern sector reports ammunition critical, requesting immediate resupply, which we cannot provide. He paused, looking at Wilk. Current rate of attrition suggests garrison combat effectiveness will reach 0 in 8 to 12 days. Silence followed. Everyone understood what combat effectiveness 0 meant: complete destruction. Everyone dead or captured. Finally, the chief of staff spoke carefully. Colonel, perhaps the situation merits requesting clarification of our orders from Corps headquarters. Translation: ask for permission to surrender without actually using that forbidden word. Wilk's response was carefully measured. Our orders are clear. Aachen will be defended as a fortress. We will hold our positions and continue inflicting maximum casualties on the enemy. His officers stared at him, trying to read his expression. Was he genuinely committed to suicidal resistance or simply saying what had to be said? In case someone reported the conversation, Wilk offered no clarification. Each sector will establish secondary fallback positions. We'll trade space for time, making Americans fight for every meter. Ammunition will be conserved. Fire only when targets present clear opportunity. Civilians remaining in our sectors will be directed to leave through American lines if possible. The orders were sensible given impossible circumstances. Buying time without admitting defeat was inevitable. His officers nodded and departed to convey orders to their subordinates. Alone again, Wilk permitted himself one moment of pure honesty. We're all going to die here. Then he pushed the thought away and returned to studying maps. Planning defenses for a city already lost. October 19th, 1944, 1500 hours. An American surrender ultimatum arrived via loudspeaker broadcast and dropped leaflets. To the German commander of Aachen, you are completely surrounded. Further resistance is pointless and will result only in unnecessary casualties and destruction. Surrender your forces within 24 hours and you will be treated according to Geneva Convention. Continue fighting and you will be responsible for the deaths of your soldiers and remaining civilians. The choice is yours. Wilk read the leaflet 3 times. The Americans weren't wrong. Resistance was pointless militarily, but surrender required permission from higher headquarters, and permission required acknowledging defeat, and acknowledging defeat was forbidden. He called his staff together to discuss the ultimatum. The conversation was careful, coded, everyone aware that walls might have ears, that discussing surrender could be reported as treason. The enemy's propaganda leaflets suggest we consider capitulation. Wilk's chief of staff said neutrally, obviously, this is unacceptable under our orders. However, Corps headquarters should be informed of the enemy's offer, as they may wish to provide guidance on our response. Wilk nodded. This was the dance, reporting facts without making recommendations, describing situation without suggesting action, letting superiors make decisions that everyone knew were predetermined. Wilk drafted a message to Cochling. Americans have issued surrender ultimatum. Request guidance on appropriate response. Garrison remains committed to defending assigned positions per standing orders. The response came within 90 minutes, faster than usual, suggesting higher headquarters had anticipated this moment. Surrender ultimatum rejected. No capitulation under any circumstances. Fortress will be held. Any commander discussing surrender will be court-martialed. Heil Hitler. Wilk read the message to his assembled staff without expression. Gentlemen, we have our answer. Return to your units and continue the defense. October 20th, 1944, evening. Wilk conducted his nightly tour of defensive positions, partly to assess situation, partly to show soldiers their commanders shared their danger. He moved through cellars and tunnels, visiting machine gun positions and observation posts, speaking briefly with soldiers who looked like ghosts, hollow-eyed, filthy, exhausted beyond exhaustion. At one position, he found 3 teenage Volkssturm soldiers, the oldest perhaps 17. They snapped to attention when Wilk appeared, trying to project military bearing despite trembling hands. How long have you been soldiers? Wilk asked gently. 6 weeks, Herr Oberst, one boy replied. 6 weeks. Against Americans who'd been fighting 4 years. Wilk felt rage, not at Americans or even at the situation, but at the system that conscripted children and called it military necessity, at the ideology that demanded this sacrifice, at himself for participating in it. But rage changed nothing. Keep low. Fire only when you have clear targets. Conserve ammunition. He left them with those inadequate words, knowing they'd probably be dead within days. Wilk's personal dilemma crystallized that night as he sat in his bunker, unable to sleep. He was a professional soldier, trained to follow orders, conditioned to obey superior officers. But he was also a human being with conscience and judgment. His orders were clear. Defend Aachen to total destruction. No surrender permitted. His conscience was equally clear. These orders were wrong, militarily pointless, morally bankrupt, serving only Hitler's obsession with symbolic resistance. Which obligation trumped the other? If he obeyed orders, 2,800 soldiers would die needlessly. If he disobeyed and surrendered, he'd be executed and his family would face reprisals. But his men would survive. The utilitarian calculation favored disobedience. The military honor code demanded obedience. And underneath both calculations lurked a darker truth. Wilk was afraid. Afraid of execution. Yes, but more afraid of being branded coward. Of having his name attached to first major German city to fall. Of being remembered as the colonel who surrendered when Hitler forbade it. Pride and fear warred with conscience and reason. And Wilk found no resolution. Only exhaustion. October 21st, 1944, 0900 hours. The final American assault began with overwhelming artillery fire. Wilk stood in his bunker doorway, watching the barrage, knowing this was the end. His options had narrowed to nothing. He could die fighting, achieving nothing except maintaining the fiction of resistance. Or he could surrender without permission, saving lives, but guaranteeing his own execution if Germany somehow survived the war. There was no good choice. Only terrible options measured against each other. When the barrage lifted and American infantry attacked, Wilk's forces fought because they were soldiers and soldiers fought. But the outcome was never in doubt. By afternoon, eastern sectors had collapsed completely. By evening, Americans were approaching his command bunker. Wilk gathered his remaining staff. Gentlemen, the defense of Aachen has ended. We will surrender to avoid further pointless casualties. His operations officer protested. Colonel, Hitler's orders. Wilk cut him off. Hitler's orders have killed enough of our men. I will not sacrifice more for his delusions. Prepare white flags. He would face consequences later. For now, he would save whoever could still be saved. The surrender itself was almost anticlimactic. Wilk emerged from his bunker at 1945 hours, wearing dress uniform he'd somehow kept clean through the siege. Accompanied by his staff bearing white flags, American soldiers surrounded them, weapons ready, suspicious of tricks. An American officer, Lieutenant Colonel John Corley, accepted Wilk's surrender, treating him with formal military courtesy despite obvious exhaustion and relief. Order your remaining forces to cease fire and assemble for surrender. Corley instructed through an interpreter. Wilk did so, sending runners to scattered positions with surrender orders. Some units complied immediately, relieved the nightmare was ending. Some SS units refused, fighting on until annihilated or finally overwhelmed. By October 22 morning, approximately 3,473 German soldiers had surrendered. Perhaps 1,500 more were dead. The rest had escaped through American lines or were unaccounted for. Aachen, Hitler's first fortress city, had fallen, and Gerhard Wilk had become the colonel who surrendered when surrender was forbidden. A decision that saved lives but cost him his honor in Nazi Germany's twisted value system. He would survive the war in prisoner camps, never prosecuted for war crimes, never celebrated as hero, simply existing in the grey space between duty and conscience, where soldiers sometimes find themselves when ideology collides with humanity. October 21, 1944, 0800 hours. Colonel Daniel Craig stood before assembled battalion commanders of the 26th Infantry Regiment, 1st Infantry Division, delivering final instructions for the assault that would, if successful, end the Battle of Aachen. Maps behind him showed the remaining German-held sectors. Perhaps 1 square kilometer of destroyed city center, surrounded on all sides, cut off and dying. Gentlemen, Craig spoke with deliberate calm. Today we finish this. 3 battalions attacking simultaneously from east, south, and north. Objective: German command bunker beneath Farwick Park. We have overwhelming superiority in every category: men, firepower, supplies, air support. This should be straightforward. He paused, scanning faces. But it won't be. The Germans have nowhere to retreat. They'll fight like cornered animals. Expect maximum resistance from minimum forces. Expect booby traps, snipers, and suicidal last stands. Take no unnecessary risks. We're winning this war. Don't be the last man to die in Aachen. 830. The artillery preparation began. Every available gun, 103 artillery pieces ranging from 75 mm pack howitzers to 155 mm heavy guns, fired on downtown Aachen. The bombardment was scientifically orchestrated. Time on target barrages coordinated, so shells from different batteries struck simultaneously, denying defenders time to take cover between impacts. The earth itself seemed to scream. Buildings that had survived weeks of fighting collapsed under concentrated fire. The Quellenhof Hotel, a 5-story structure converted into German strongpoint, disappeared in a series of explosions, walls folding inward, roof pancaking through floors, dust and smoke billowing. 30 minutes of apocalyptic violence that consumed more ammunition than some entire World War I battles. When the guns fell silent at 0900, the city center resembled a lunar landscape. Nothing intact. Everything broken, smoke obscuring the sun. 900 hours, infantry advanced behind rolling smoke screens. 1st Battalion, 26th Infantry pushed from the east. 3 companies in line, tanks in support. They encountered immediate resistance despite the bombardment. German machine guns firing from rubble piles, snipers in destroyed buildings, Panzer Force teams stalking American armor. But the resistance was disorganized, desperate, lacking coordination or reserves. American soldiers moved methodically, using hard-won tactical lessons. Advance under covering fire, suppress suspected positions before closing, use grenades liberally, assume nothing until verified. The advance was slow but steady, measured in meters per hour rather than kilometers. By mid-morning, 1st Battalion had penetrated 500 meters into the German pocket, cutting it in half. Sergeant Robert Mills led his squad through rubble that had been, according to his map, the Adalbert Stray district. Nothing remained recognizable, no intact buildings, no clear streets, just wreckage piled on wreckage. His squad moved in dispersed formation, each man covering different angles, communicating through hand signals to avoid noise. Movement ahead, Mills signaled freeze, everyone dropping prone behind cover. A German soldier appeared from a cellar entrance 50 yards away, looked around confused, then raised his rifle toward American positions. 4 and 1 Garand fired simultaneously. The German fell. Mills' squad advanced, clearing the cellar where the German had emerged empty, except for medical supplies and abandoned equipment. They continued pushing deeper into the pocket, encountering clusters of resistance that dissolved under concentrated fire, finding more abandoned positions than defended ones. The German defense was collapsing not through dramatic breakthrough, but through cumulative exhaustion, defenders running out of ammunition, running out of positions, running out of will. 1,130 hours, engineers from the 745th Tank Battalion demolished the Quellenhof Hotel's remains. Despite artillery damage, the structure's cellars remained intact. German soldiers defending from underground positions. Standard infantry assault would cost significant casualties clearing those cellars room by room. Engineering solution: place 1,000 pounds of TNT against the structure's foundation. Evacuate surrounding areas. Detonate. The explosion was felt 3 miles away, a deep bass thud that compressed air and shook ground, followed by prolonged rumble as the entire structure collapsed into its own cellars. When dust cleared, nothing remained above ground except a crater. Engineers moved forward, cautiously checking for survivors. They found 17 German soldiers alive in a cellar section that had somehow survived, dazed and deafened but uninjured. The Germans surrendered without resistance, too stunned to fight. 1,400 hours. American soldiers raised the stars and stripes over Aachen's damaged Rathaus City Hall. The building was a shell, medieval architecture reduced to broken walls and empty windows, but it remained the city's symbolic center. Lieutenant Frank Morrison and 3 soldiers scrambled over rubble to the building's highest intact point, attached the flag to a bent metal pole, and raised it while photographers captured the moment. German soldiers in nearby positions could see the flag rising, understand what it meant. Some surrendered immediately, some kept fighting. A few turned their weapons on themselves rather than face capture. Morrison stood beside the flag for exactly 30 seconds, long enough for photographs, then scrambled down as German sniper fire cracked past his position. The flag itself drew fire, German bullets tearing holes through fabric, but it remained flying. By evening, every American in Aachen knew the flag was up. The message was clear. This city was conquered. 1,600 hours, American forces seized the Lausberg, a hill in Aachen's northern sector, offering commanding views. The hill had been German observation posts throughout the battle, directing artillery fire, coordinating defensive movements. Losing it blinded the German defense. Captain William Hayes led the assault, to platoons advancing up the slope under covering fire from tanks and machine guns. Resistance was fierce initially, Germans recognizing the position's importance, but collapsed quickly once Americans gained the hilltop. By 1,700 hours, American observers on Lausberg were directing artillery fire onto remaining German positions, with perfect accuracy, crushing any organized resistance. The German defense went from coordinated to chaotic in the space of hours. Individual units fighting in isolation, unable to communicate with command, making decisions based on immediate circumstances rather than overall strategy. 1,700 hours, American forces entered the Cathedral District, the symbolic and spiritual heart of Aachen. The cathedral itself, Charlemagne's 1,000-year-old church, had suffered damage but remained largely intact, spared by both sides' reluctance to destroy such a historic structure. But the surrounding district was devastated. American soldiers moved cautiously through rubble, expecting fierce resistance in defense of this symbolically vital area. Instead, they found mostly abandoned positions. German soldiers had fled or died elsewhere. The cathedral's interior became a temporary aid station. Wounded from both sides treated under vaulted ceilings that had witnessed centuries of coronations, prayers, and history. Medics worked by candlelight, their medical instruments seeming medieval against the ancient stonework. Outside, fighting continued in nearby streets, but the cathedral existed in a bubble of relative peace. Sacred space respected even in war's midst. 1,800 hours. Organized German resistance effectively ended. Isolated pockets continued fighting. SS units refusing surrender. Scattered soldiers unaware the defense had collapsed. A few fanatics determined to die rather than quit. But coordinated defense no longer existed. American soldiers encountered more surrendering Germans than fighting ones, processing hundreds of prisoners who emerged from cellars with hands raised, relieved to be finished. Prisoner collection points overflowed. German soldiers sat in rubble under guard, many weeping, some staring blankly, all exhibiting signs of complete physical and psychological exhaustion. American soldiers were little better. They'd won but felt no triumph, only exhaustion and relief that this particular nightmare was ending. October 21st was the costliest single day of the entire battle. Despite overwhelming advantages, despite coordination and firepower, the final assault cost 89 Americans killed and 267 wounded. German casualties were impossible to calculate precisely, at least 200 killed. During the day's fighting, hundreds more wounded, the remainder surrendering. The mathematics proved again what every urban battle teaches. Attackers suffer even when victory is certain, because determined defenders in fortified positions extract blood price regardless of eventual outcome. The final storm had broken German resistance, but storms damage everything they touch, victors and vanquished alike. By nightfall, October 21st, American soldiers occupied most of Aachen center. German resistance reduced to isolated holdouts, and everyone understood the battle was essentially over. Only the formal surrender remained, the bureaucratic ending to what had been 40 days of industrial-scale violence that destroyed a city, killed thousands, and proved that urban warfare remains modern combat's most costly, complex, and morally ambiguous form. The storm had passed. Only rubble and exhausted survivors remained to witness what victory looked like. When it came wrapped in destruction, the map in Hitler's Rastenburg headquarters showed dozens of cities circled in red ink. Aachen, Metz, Brest, Budapest, Nijmegen, and eventually Berlin itself. Each circle represented a festung, a fortress city to be defended to the last man under Hitler's doctrine of fanatical resistance. The Führer's logic was simple to the point of delusion. Every city held delayed Allied advances, inflicted casualties, demonstrated German will. Retreating preserved combat power, but looked weak. Fighting to annihilation looked strong even if it squandered irreplaceable soldiers. This was ideology masquerading as strategy. Hitler's personal psychology elevated to military doctrine. The results were catastrophic. Aachen would be the first test of fortress doctrine on German soil, and its failure would be repeated again and again across dozens of cities as Nazi Germany collapsed. Military professionals understood the doctrine was suicidal. Hitler didn't care. Symbolism trumped strategy. Appearance mattered more than reality, and tens of thousands of German soldiers would die proving what competent officers already knew. The fortress doctrine was military insanity. The numbers told the story that ideology denied. Aachen's garrison, approximately 5,000 soldiers at the battle's start, casualties, roughly 5,000 killed, wounded, or captured, a 100% loss rate. Time delay imposed on American advance, 40 days. Strategic value gained, none. Americans simply went down the city and continued advancing elsewhere while reducing Aachen. Alternative strategy comparison. If those 5,000 soldiers had been deployed in mobile defense, trading space for time, conducting fighting withdrawals to prepared positions, they could have delayed American advance for comparable time, while preserving 50 to 70% of their combat power. That preserved combat power could then be redeployed to other threatened sectors. The fortress doctrine's only advantage was psychological. It looked determined, but that psychological advantage was purchased at catastrophic material cost. Germany was losing the war through attrition. Hitler's response was to accelerate that attrition through policies that guaranteed maximum German casualties for minimum Allied delay. Stalingrad should have taught this lesson. Winter 1942 to 1943. Hitler declared Stalingrad a fortress, forbade withdrawal, and watched 300,000 German soldiers die or surrender in one of history's greatest military disasters. The lesson was clear. Encircled forces with no supply, no reinforcement, and no retreat route will be destroyed regardless of their courage or determination. Yet Hitler learned the opposite lesson. Stalingrad fell because soldiers lacked sufficient fanaticism, because commanders were traitors, because the defense simply needed to be more determined. So he doubled down on fortress doctrine, applying it more widely, enforcing it more strictly, punishing any suggestion of withdrawal more severely. This was madness, repeating failed tactics and expecting different results, but madness that shaped German strategy for the war's final 2 years. Every fortress city became miniature Stalingrad, and German military effectiveness bled away in pointless last stands that achieved nothing beyond temporary propaganda victories. Military analysts comparing fortress doctrine to alternative strategies found the doctrine catastrophically ineffective by every metric. Casualty exchange ratio. Fortress defenses produced roughly 1-to-1 casualty rates. 1 German loss per American loss, compared to 3-to-1 or better in mobile defense where Germans could use terrain and maneuver. Time delay per soldier committed. Fortress defense averaged approximately 8 hours of delay per soldier, while mobile defense produced 12 to 18 hours delay per soldier. Resource efficiency. Fortress cities consumed disproportionate artillery, ammunition, food, and medical supplies while surrounded, whereas mobile forces could be resupplied continuously. Combat power preservation. Fortress doctrine guaranteed 100% loss rates, while mobile doctrine enabled 60 to 80% of forces to survive and fight again. The only advantage of fortress doctrine was that it required less sophisticated command and control. Troops ordered to hold positions needed minimal direction, but that advantage was swamped by disadvantages in every category that mattered. The fortress doctrine's psychological impact on German soldiers was corrosive. Professional officers understood they were being ordered to execute military suicide, yet couldn't say so without risking execution for defeatism. Soldiers understood they were trapped, yet couldn't retreat without facing charges of cowardice. The cognitive dissonance following orders, are fatal, created immense psychological stress. Some soldiers embraced fanaticism as psychological defense mechanism, convincing themselves that ideological determination could overcome material reality. Others became grimly fatalistic, fighting because refusing meant death from their own side. Still others sought ways to survive through feigned illness, self-inflicted wounds, or careful timing of surrenders. The fortress doctrine didn't create military effectiveness. It created desperation that sometimes looked like effectiveness, but was actually psychological breakdown manifesting as combat activity. The comparison to Soviet fortress defense reveals the doctrine's flaws. Soviets also defended cities ferociously: Leningrad, Stalingrad, Moscow, but with crucial differences. Soviet fortress defenses were elastic, with defenders falling back through prepared positions, preserving forces while inflicting casualties. Soviet fortresses received continuous supply and reinforcement, maintaining combat capability. Soviet fortress defenses served strategic purposes. Leningrad tied down entire German armies. Moscow protected the Soviet capital and rail hub. Stalingrad blocked German access to oil fields. Hitler's fortresses served no comparable strategic purpose. Aachen didn't block any critical route. Americans simply went down it. Metz didn't protect vital resources. Budapest's defense came after Hungary had already effectively switched sides. These were ideological symbols defended because Nazi mythology required defending them, not strategic positions that military logic dictated holding. The fortress doctrine's impact on Allied operations was significant, but not decisive. 40 days to take Aachen, 55 days for Metz, 102 days for Budapest. These delays were real and costly. But the delays didn't prevent Allied victory, merely postponed it. And the delays were purchased at unsustainable cost to German combat power. Every soldier lost defending fortress cities was a soldier unavailable for mobile defense elsewhere. By February 1945, German forces on both western and eastern fronts were critically short of infantry. Units existed at 20 to 30% strength, equipped with Volkssturm substitutes, cobbled together from rear echelon personnel and convalescent hospitals. This personnel crisis was directly attributable to fortress city losses. Tens of thousands of soldiers ground to nothing in static defenses that achieved temporary delays, while destroying irreplaceable combat power. German generals privately condemned fortress doctrine in language they couldn't use publicly. General Heinz Guderian, Army Chief of Staff, argued repeatedly for mobile defense and elastic withdrawal. Hitler rejected these arguments as defeatism. Field Marshal von Rundstedt, commanding Western Front, requested permission to abandon untenable positions and establish defensible lines farther east. Hitler forbade any withdrawal. General Gotthard Heinrici, one of Germany's most skilled defensive commanders, perfected elastic defense techniques on Eastern Front, identifying kill zones, establishing multiple defensive lines, withdrawing before encirclement, and his sectors consistently delayed Soviets longer with fewer casualties than sectors employing fortress doctrine. Hitler ignored these successes, preferring comforting delusions of fanatical resistance to uncomfortable realities of professional military practice. The fortress doctrine persisted not because it worked, but because Hitler demanded it, and no one could stop him without risking execution. The doctrine's ultimate failure became undeniable by war's end. Every fortress city fell. Every garrison was destroyed. Every temporary delay was purchased at permanent cost to German military capability. Aachen fell after 40 days. Metz fell after 55 days. Budapest fell after 102 days. Niggsburg fell after 85 days. Berlin fell after 16 days of house-to-house fighting that killed tens of thousands for no purpose, except delaying inevitable surrender. In total, fortress doctrine consumed perhaps 150,000 to 200,000 German soldiers in pointless last stands that delayed Allied victory by perhaps 4 to 6 months, while hastening German collapse through unsustainable attrition. This was strategic bankruptcy masquerading as determination, military incompetence dressed in ideological rhetoric, a defense policy that guaranteed the outcome it supposedly opposed. The lesson Aachen taught was clear to everyone except those who needed to learn it. Static defense of surrounded positions against enemies with overwhelming firepower is military suicide. The fortress doctrine's only success was psychological. It allowed Hitler to maintain illusions of resistance while Germany died. It gave Nazi propaganda temporary material for heroic sacrifice stories. It enabled Hitler to blame defeatist generals for defeats, rather than acknowledging his own catastrophic strategic decisions. But it destroyed German military capability, killed hundreds of thousands of soldiers needlessly, and accelerated Germany's defeat. Aachen was the test case, the first fortress city on German soil, the proof that Hitler's doctrine was wrong. That lesson would be repeated in city after city across the closing months of the war. Same doctrine, same results, same waste of lives for same lack of strategic benefit. The fortress doctrine was Hitler's gift to the Allies, a guarantee that Germany would destroy its own army faster than enemies could manage alone. October 21st, 1944, 18:30 hours. American infantry surrounded Colonel Gerhard Wilkes' command bunker beneath Farwick Park, the last German headquarters still functioning in Aachen. The bunker's entrance was barricaded, from inside steel doors reinforced with sandbags, the whole position designed to withstand direct artillery hits. Lieutenant Colonel John Corley positioned his men and the bunker's perimeter, called for interpreter, and approached within shouting distance. German commander, Corley's voice echoed off concrete. "You are surrounded. Your city has fallen. Surrender your forces and you will be treated according to Geneva Convention. Silence from the bunker. Corley waited 30 seconds, then repeated the demand. Still silence. He turned to his artillery observer. If they don't respond in 5 minutes, we'll bury them. The observer nodded, already calculating coordinates. 3 minutes passed. Then the bunker's steel door opened 6 inches, and the white cloth emerged, waving slowly. Corley relaxed slightly. Hold fire. They're coming out. Inside the bunker, Wilk made final preparations for surrender. He'd already ordered scattered German units to cease fire, sent runners with white flags to notify American forces that resistance was ending. Now came the personal humiliation, surrendering himself, ending his military career, becoming prisoner instead of commander. He straightened his uniform, checked his appearance in a cracked mirror. 51 years old, career soldier, veteran of multiple campaigns, now the colonel who surrendered Charlemagne's city. History would judge him harshly. He knew. Nazi propaganda would brand him traitor. His family would suffer social stigma. He'd likely face court-martial if Germany somehow survived the war. But his remaining soldiers would live. That calculation, 2,800 lives against his own honor, made the choice obvious, even if painful. Wilk turned to his staff. Gentlemen, prepare to surrender. Destroy all documents. Gather personal effects. We're finished here. Greater than snorts, greater than 1900 hours. The bunker door opened fully and Wilk emerged into evening light. Blinking after hours underground. He wore dress uniform, somehow kept clean through the siege, medals on his chest. Expression carefully neutral. Behind him came his staff, 11 officers, various ranks and branches, all showing signs of exhaustion and defeat. They stood in line before the bunker entrance, hands visible, making no threatening movements. American soldiers surrounded them, weapons ready, but not aimed. Corley approached, studying Wilk with professional interest. Here was the man who'd held Aachen for 40 days. Commanded a defense that cost American forces 750 casualties. Turned a simple city capture into grinding attrition battle. Corley felt no hatred, only tired respect. They were both soldiers. Circumstances had made them enemies. Circumstances were now making them captor and prisoner. I am Colonel Gerhard Wilk, Commandant of the Aachen garrison. Wilk said in heavily accented English. I request terms of surrender. Corley gestured to his interpreter. Tell him there are no terms. His forces will lay down arms immediately and surrender unconditionally. Officers will be separated and transported to prisoner collection points. Enlisted men will be searched and detained. All will be treated according to Geneva Convention. The interpreter translated. Wilk nodded slowly, expecting nothing else. I accept. I request written guarantee that my soldiers will not be harmed after surrender. Corley considered. The request was reasonable. Agreed. Provide immediate written orders to all your remaining units to cease fire and assemble for surrender. Once compliance begins, your men will be protected. Wilk began drafting orders immediately using a clipboard provided by American soldier. Writing in German with careful precision, the surrender orders went to scattered German positions via runners carrying white flags. Most units complied immediately. Soldiers emerging from cellars and ruins with hands raised, relieved the nightmare was ending. A few SS units refused, declaring they'd fight to death rather than surrender. American forces bypassed those holdouts initially, focusing on processing the Germans who'd accepted surrender. By 2,200 hours, approximately 2,300 German soldiers had assembled in designated collection areas, disarmed and under guard. Another 800 were accounted for in various states, wounded in aid stations, isolated units still receiving orders, dead bodies not yet recovered. Perhaps 300 to 400 remained unaccounted for, either escaped through American lines, hiding in ruins intending to fight on, or dead in locations no one knew. October 22nd, 0600 hours, the final German holdouts were reduced. American forces used overwhelming firepower against SS positions that refused surrender. Tanks firing point blank, engineers demolishing buildings with explosives, infantry mopping up survivors. It was brutal, efficient, and quick. By 0900, all organized resistance had ceased. The last German soldier captured in Aachen was an SS Unterscharfe sergeant named Wilhelm Brandt, found alone in a cellar, wounded and delirious, still gripping an empty rifle. Medics treated his wounds despite his protests. He wanted to die fighting, not be captured. They sedated him, evacuated him to medical facility, where he survived and spent the next 3 years in prisoner camp. He was 19 years old. The prisoner count finalized over following days. 3,473 German soldiers surrendered or captured in Aachen. Approximately 5,000 had defended the city at battle's start. The missing 1,527 were killed, died of wounds, or escaped. Final casualty assessment for German forces: roughly 35% killed, 15% wounded and captured, 50% captured and wounded, with small percentage unaccounted. These were catastrophic losses by any standard, equivalent to complete destruction of the garrison. American casualties in comparison: approximately 500 killed, 2,500 wounded, 200 missing, total 3,200, or 64% of German losses despite being attackers against prepared defenses. The casualty exchange ratio, roughly 1.1 American casualties per German casualty, was far worse than standard military doctrine predicted for attackers, but far better than early estimates suggested. Urban combat had proven murderously egalitarian, killing defenders and attackers with comparable efficiency. Wilk was processed as prisoner with unusual courtesy. American intelligence officers wanted detailed information about German defensive tactics, garrison composition, command decisions. Wilk cooperated fully, providing technical information while carefully avoiding anything that might be considered intelligence value to enemies. He described defensive positions, unit organizations, tactical doctrines. He avoided discussing German forces outside Aachen, strategic planning, or classified information. His interrogators respected the distinction. One American officer asked directly, "Colonel, you're a professional soldier. Why did you hold so long when the situation was hopeless?" Wilk's answer was careful. "I followed my orders. My orders were to defend Aachen. I defended Aachen until my capacity to do so was destroyed." The American nodded. Both understood what Wilk couldn't say. He defended because refusing meant execution, because Hitler's doctrine demanded it, because Nazi system offered no alternative. The American made notes and moved to next question. Wilk survived the war in prisoner camps, never facing war crimes. Prosecution investigators found no evidence of atrocities under his command. He was repatriated to Germany in 1947, returned to find his country destroyed, his military career finished, his honor questioned by those who believed fortress commanders should have died, rather than surrendered. He lived quietly until his death in 1972, rarely discussing the war, never justifying his decisions publicly. In private letters, he expressed no regrets about surrendering. Saving 2,800 lives justified any personal cost. His only regrets were accepting the Aachen command initially and not finding way to surrender sooner. Before more soldiers died pointlessly, whether history judged him hero or coward, competent commander or failed officer, he knew his own truth. He followed orders as long as possible, then chose conscience over ideology when the moment demanded decision. That calculus duty versus humanity defines the moral complexity soldiers face when serving unjust regimes. Wilk made his choice. 2,800 German soldiers survived to go home because he did. The symbolic significance of Aachen's fall wasn't lost on either side. For Americans, this was the first major German city captured, proof that Germany itself could be conquered, that the war could be brought to German heartland. Propaganda value was immense. For Germans, Aachen's fall punctured Hitler's mythology of impregnable defense, suggested that perhaps fortress doctrine was wrong, raised questions about whether Germany could actually survive. Goebbels' propaganda machine tried to spin the loss. Heroic defense delayed Americans. Garrison inflicted heavy casualties. German will prove unbreakable. But the facts remained. Hitler had declared Aachen would not fall, and Aachen had fallen. The emperor's nakedness was becoming visible even to those invested in believing otherwise. Aachen's surrender didn't end the war, didn't change strategic situation dramatically, didn't break German will to fight. But it was the first crack in the fortress doctrine's facade. The first undeniable proof that Hitler's not one step back. Rhetoric couldn't overcome material reality. More cracks would follow in city after city across the war's final months, until the facade collapsed entirely in Berlin's rubble. Hitler dead by his own hand. Fortress doctrine finally abandoned because no one remained to enforce it. October 22, 1944 morning. Captain David Goldman walked through Aachen's destroyed city centre, stepping carefully over rubble and debris, professionally documenting what he saw. As battalion surgeon, Goldman had treated over 800 casualties during the 40-day battle. Now he was witnessing the larger casualty, the city itself. Entire blocks reduced to rubble. Buildings that had stood for centuries collapsed into their own cellars. Streets unrecognizable, buried under tons of broken stone and twisted steel. Bodies still being recovered, sometimes in pieces, sometimes so mangled that identification was impossible, sometimes merely buried under rubble that would take days to clear. Goldman stopped at what had been a children's school, now just a foundation and scattered bricks. He tried to imagine children's voices, teachers' lessons, ordinary life before this happened. The imagination failed. This landscape was beyond ordinary life, beyond redemption through any means Goldman could envision. This was what victory looked like when won through urban warfare. Total comprehensive destruction that made winning and losing equally meaningless terms. The casualty statistics compiled over following weeks told story that both validated and condemned the operation. American forces, approximately 1,500 killed in action, 3,500 wounded, 200 missing or captured, 5,200 casualties. German forces, approximately 5,000 killed, wounded, captured, effectively 100% loss rate for the garrison. Civilian casualties, estimated 5,000 to 6,000 killed. Number inherently uncertain because many bodies were never recovered or identified. Physical destruction, 85% of city structures damaged or destroyed beyond immediate repair. Historical landmarks damaged, Rathaus, Ellissenbrunnen, numerous churches, medieval city walls, countless residential and commercial buildings of architectural significance. Territory captured, 63 square kilometers. Time required, 40 days. These numbers, individually stark, became obscene when combined. 40 days to capture 63 square kilometers meant advancing less than 2 kilometers per day, at cost of 130 casualties per day. This was warfare reduced to industrial attrition, humans processed through destruction machine. Geography captured meter by meter through blood expenditure. October 23, 1944 afternoon. Civilians began emerging from cellars and ruins, where they'd sheltered during the battle's final days. Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell, civil affairs officer attached to 1st Infantry Division, supervised civilian processing at a collection point outside the city. The civilians appeared like ghosts, filthy, hollow-eyed, many injured, all traumatized. An elderly woman approached Mitchell speaking German. Mitchell barely understood. The interpreter translated. She wants to know if she can return to her home. Mitchell consulted the map, identified the address. That neighborhood no longer existed, completely destroyed, nothing standing. Mitchell struggled to find words. Tell her she can't return yet. We'll arrange temporary shelter. The woman began weeping silently. Mitchell felt helpless. What shelter? What future? This woman's entire life had been destroyed. Allied victory meant her personal apocalypse. How do you comfort someone experiencing that? The civilian casualty toll was particularly haunting because of its uncertainty. Official estimates ranged from 5,000 to 8,000 dead, but actual number was unknowable. Many bodies were buried in collapsed buildings, would remain buried indefinitely. Many civilians had fled during the battle, their fate unrecorded. Some had been killed by German forces for attempting to evacuate, their bodies left in streets. Others died in cellars from disease, starvation, or untreated wounds. Still others were killed in crossfire, unable to distinguish between sides or safety. The surviving civilians, approximately 15,000 out of original 20,000, who'd remained after the September evacuation order, carried physical and psychological scars that would last lifetimes. Children who'd witnessed horrors no child should see. Adults who'd lost everything. Elderly people who'd survived 2 world wars only to see their city destroyed in the second. These people weren't combatants. They weren't military targets. They were simply unlucky enough to live in a historically significant city during a war that didn't distinguish between military and civilian spaces. Brigade Commander Colonel Craig wrote his after-action report with unusual candor, knowing his words would be scrutinized by historians. The reduction of Aachen cost this command 5,200 casualties over 40 days of continuous operations. He wrote, "The enemy garrison was destroyed, the city captured, and the strategic objective achieved. However, the cost in blood, material, and time raises serious questions about the efficacy of urban warfare as operational method. We expended more ammunition taking Aachen than was used in Normandy breakout. We suffered more casualties in 40 days than in the previous 3 months combined. The city itself has been destroyed so thoroughly that its capture provides minimal tactical benefit. Roads are impassable, structures unusable, population displaced. Recommendation: future operations should bypass defended cities when possible, reducing them through siege and isolation rather than frontal assault. The urban warfare tactics developed during this operation should be preserved for when urban combat is unavoidable, but every effort should be made to avoid such combat when alternative approaches exist." November 1944. German newsreel footage showed Aachen's ruins. Carefully edited propaganda presenting the destruction as evidence of American barbarity. Goebbels' commentary accused Americans of deliberately destroying German cultural heritage, murdering civilians, conducting war of annihilation against German people. The propaganda was cynical. Nazis had ordered the defense that guaranteed the city's destruction, had trapped civilians as human shields, had refused all surrender opportunities. But it was also effective. Germans who viewed the footage saw their fears confirmed. The Allies would destroy Germany completely if not stopped. The propaganda omitted German responsibility, Nazi fortress doctrine, Hitler's orders forbidding surrender. It presented only destroyed city and blamed Americans entirely. Some Germans believed this narrative uncritically. Others recognized the manipulation, but felt helpless. A few understood that Nazi policies had created the conditions for Aachen's destruction, but those few couldn't speak publicly without risking execution for defeatism. The physical reconstruction of Aachen would take decades. Immediate priorities were rubble clearance, restoring basic services, housing displaced population. American engineers began work immediately using heavy equipment to clear main roads. German civilians conscripted for manual labor. Unexploded ordnance was everywhere. American shells that failed to detonate. German mines, booby traps, scattered ammunition. Demolition teams worked for months removing explosive hazards. Bodies continued being discovered through November and December, sometimes identifiable, often not, all requiring proper burial. By January 1945, perhaps 30% of rubble had been cleared and temporary shelters erected for civilians. Full reconstruction, rebuilding destroyed structures, restoring historical monuments, recreating cities' pre-war character wouldn't begin until after the war's end, and would continue into the 1950s and 60s. Some destruction proved permanent. The medieval city centre could be rebuilt but not restored. Too much was simply gone, destroyed so thoroughly that original character was irretrievable. The psychological casualties on American side manifested in various ways and timelines. Some soldiers broke during the battle, evacuated as combat exhaustion cases, spent months or years recovering if they recovered at all. Others seemed fine during combat but deteriorated afterward, peacetime removing the adrenaline and purpose that had sustained them. Still others carried trauma invisibly for decades, seemingly functional but haunted by memories that surfaced in nightmares, triggered by sounds or smells, manifested in relationship difficulties and substance abuse. The Department of Veterans Affairs would treat Aachen veterans for post-traumatic stress disorder for the next 70 years, though the diagnosis didn't exist in 1944. One sergeant interviewed in 1993, at age 71, described still having nightmares about clearing buildings. "I dream I'm back there, going room to room, never knowing what's behind the next door. I wake up screaming sometimes. My wife understands or tries to, but you can't explain it to someone who wasn't there. The fear, the violence, the things we did and saw. Aachen took pieces of all of us. Some pieces never grew back. The material cost was calculated with accounting precision that seemed obscene given human suffering involved. American ammunition expenditure: 1.2 million artillery shells, 18 million small arms rounds, 47,000 grenades, 3,000 anti-tank rockets. Vehicle losses: 63 tanks destroyed or disabled, 97 other vehicles lost. Medical evacuations: 3,700 soldiers processing through aid stations and field hospitals that operated continuously throughout battle. Replacement soldiers required 5,200 to restore units to pre-battle strength. Time and territory: 40 days to capture 63 square kilometers, roughly 1.6 square kilometers per day. Cost per square kilometer: 80 to casualties, 30,000 artillery shells, 300,000 small arms rounds. These numbers, compiled by staff officers for planning future operations, were militarily useful and morally devastating. They reduced human suffering to logistical data, treating soldiers and civilians as resources expended toward objectives, rather than individuals experiencing and causing trauma. The reckoning wasn't just a counting exercise, it was moral inventory of what urban warfare costs everyone it touches. Soldiers on both sides killed and died, many for reasons that seemed increasingly arbitrary. The longer fighting continued, civilians suffered and perished because geography placed them in historically significant city during historically terrible war. A city that had stood for over 1,200 years was destroyed in 40 days. The physical landscape would eventually be rebuilt. The human landscape, the soldiers who fought there, the civilians who endured it, the families who lost loved ones would carry Aachen's scars forever. Victory was achieved, strategic objectives accomplished, but the victory tasted like ashes in mouths of those who'd won it. The accomplishment felt hollow when measured against the cost. This was the reckoning, understanding that sometimes winning and losing are distinctions without meaning, that urban warfare creates only victims in different uniforms, that the price of tactical success can exceed any reasonable definition of strategic benefit. Aachen was won, but everyone who touched it lost something they'd never recover. That was the true cost, incalculable in any report. Aachen, Germany, 1994. Elderly men gathered in the rebuilt city center, some wearing American veterans' caps, others in German civilian clothes. 50 years after the battle, survivors from both sides met at memorial ceremony. Awkward handshakes between men who tried to kill each other decades ago. An American veteran, 72 years old, stood before a German civilian, 76, who'd survived the siege as teenager. They stared at each other for a long moment, then embraced briefly, uncomfortably. Neither spoke the other's language. Words weren't necessary. They shared something that transcended language, survival event that had tried to kill them both. Understanding of trauma that only fellow survivors could comprehend. A German veteran approached American, showed him photograph of machine gun position he defended. The American examined it, then pulled out his own photograph, showing the street where he'd fought. Same street, 50 years earlier, same rubble from different perspectives. They compared memories, trying to piece together which of them might have been shooting at the other, whether they'd ever actually seen each other through the smoke and chaos. The exercise was futile but necessary, trying to make sense of senseless violence, seeking meaning in randomness, connecting across the void war had created between them. The tactical lessons learned at Aachen entered United States Army doctrine, and remain there 80 years later. Field Manual 306 Urban Operations draws extensively on Aachen experience. Combined arms coordination essential. Infantry tank teams required. Specialized training necessary. Civilians complicate everything. Ammunition consumption exceeds any peacetime estimate. Casualties will be high regardless of preparation. Military academies study Aachen alongside Stalingrad, Manila, Hue, Fallujah. Urban battles that prove certain principles transcend technology and time. Cities favor defenders by providing cover and concealment. Cities negate attacker advantages in mobility and firepower. Cities make distinguishing combatants from civilians nearly impossible. Cities consume attackers through attrition even when attackers possess overwhelming superiority. These lessons were written in blood in Aachen 1944, rewritten in blood in subsequent urban battles, and will likely be written again in future conflicts. Because the fundamental problems of urban warfare resist technological solutions, the comparison to subsequent urban battles reveals disturbing patterns. Aachen 1944, 40 days, 5,000 American casualties, 85% destruction. Manila 1945, 37 days, estimated 1,000 American casualties, 16,000 Japanese casualties, 100,000 civilian casualties, complete destruction of Old City. Hue 1968, 26 days, 142 American killed, 516 wounded, 5,000 North Vietnamese casualties, unknown, thousands of civilian casualties, 80% of city destroyed. Fallujah 2004, 46 days, both offensives combined, 95 American killed, 560 wounded, estimated 2,000 insurgent casualties, unknown civilian casualties, 60% of city damaged or destroyed. The pattern repeats across 80 years. Attacker casualties in low thousands, defender casualties higher, civilian casualties often exceeding both. Physical destruction catastrophic. Time required measured in weeks of grinding combat. Greater than snorts, greater than technology changes from M1 Garants to M16 rifles to advanced drones. But fundamental mathematics of urban warfare remain depressingly consistent. The ethical questions Aachen raised remain unresolved and perhaps unresolvable. When does military necessity justify civilian casualties? How much destruction is acceptable to achieve strategic objectives? What responsibility do attackers bear for damage caused while liberating occupied territory? What responsibility do defenders bear for using civilians as shields? How do you distinguish between collateral damage and deliberate targeting? These questions don't have clear answers because they involve competing moral imperatives that cannot be fully reconciled. Military necessity sometimes conflicts with civilian protection. Strategic objectives sometimes require tactical methods that cause suffering. Liberation sometimes looks like destruction to those being liberated. Aachen exemplified these dilemmas in 1944. Modern urban conflicts from Grozny to Mosul to Mariupol continue exemplifying them. The moral ambiguity isn't exception. It's inherent feature of urban warfare that no technological advance or doctrinal revision eliminates. Modern military study Aachen seeking tactical lessons, but often miss strategic lesson. Urban warfare's costs often exceed its benefits. The 40 days spent reducing Aachen could have been spent advancing elsewhere. The 5,000 American casualties weakened divisions needed for future operations. The ammunition consumed strained logistics. The psychological toll created long-term casualties that manifested years later. Strategically, Aachen could have been bypassed, isolated, starved into submission with fraction of the cost, but military culture, political pressure, and symbolic significance demanded capturing the city quickly and decisively. Similar pressures shape modern urban operations. Political leadership wants visible success. Public opinion demands action. Symbolic targets attract resources regardless of strategic value. This is how Aachen happens again and again. Tactical necessity becomes strategic imperative because alternatives seem weak or slow, and costs are discovered only after commitment is irreversible. The civilian protection challenge Aachen presented remains unsolved. How do you conduct urban warfare without massive civilian casualties? When enemies use civilians as shields, when civilians can't or won't evacuate, when distinguishing combatants from non-combatants is impossible. Modern military doctrine mandates proportionality. Damage to civilians must not exceed military advantage gained. But proportionality calculations in urban combat are inherently subjective. Who decides when civilian casualties exceed military benefit? How do you make that calculation while under fire, in confusion, with incomplete information? Aachen's approximately 6,000 civilian deaths resulted from combination of German policies trapping civilians and American firepower destroying defenses. Both sides could claim they hadn't deliberately targeted civilians, while both contributed to civilian death toll. This pattern shared responsibility, combined with mutual denial, recurs in modern urban conflicts where all parties claim to protect civilians, while none can prevent civilian suffering inherent in city-destroying warfare. The technological advances since 1944, precision munitions, night vision, urban warfare training facilities, sophisticated command and control, have improved tactical execution, but haven't fundamentally changed urban warfare's nature. Modern soldiers clear buildings faster and more efficiently than their World War I predecessors. Modern weapons can strike with accuracy impossible in 1944. Modern intelligence provides information soldiers in Aachen would have considered miraculous. Yet, modern urban battles still produce catastrophic destruction, high casualties, civilian suffering, and psychological trauma. Fallujah veterans describe experiences remarkably similar to Aachen veterans' accounts. Room-by-room clearing, intimate violence, moral ambiguity, lasting trauma. Technology improves effectiveness, but doesn't reduce costs proportionally. Sometimes it increases costs by enabling operations that would have been impossible previously. The fundamental problem: humans fighting in civilian environments, where distinguishing friend from enemy is difficult, and every structure's potential fortress remains unsolved. Despite 80 years of technological advancement, the fortress doctrine's failure at Aachen didn't prevent its repetition. Hitler declared dozens more fortress cities after Aachen fell, each one consumed in similar destruction, each one proving again that static defense of surrounded positions is suicide. Post-war military studies universally condemned fortress doctrine. Yet, similar mistakes recur. Grozny, 1994 to 1995. Russian forces expected quick victory, encountered fanatical resistance, suffered catastrophic casualties in urban fighting. Russian command could have bypassed or besieged Grozny, but chose frontal assault for political reasons. Second Battle of Fallujah, 2004. American forces' new city was defended, could have isolated and starved insurgents, chose frontal assault partly because political timeline demanded visible action. Mariupol, 2022. Ukrainian defenders held against overwhelming Russian forces in conscious echo of Aachen and Stalingrad, inflicting heavy casualties while being destroyed themselves. The tactical situation differs, political contexts vary, but pattern repeats. Defenders in cities can inflict disproportionate casualties on attackers, making urban warfare costly even when outcome is certain, creating situations where both sides lose regardless of who controls rubble afterward. Aachen's physical reconstruction demonstrates resilience, but can't fully repair what was lost. The city was rebuilt, structures replaced, infrastructure modernized, historical monuments restored where possible. Modern Aachen is prosperous, peaceful, successful European city. Yet, something is irretrievably gone. The medieval city center's organic character, developed over centuries, cannot be replicated through planned reconstruction. The continuity of place buildings, where generations lived, streets walked by ancestors, physical connection to deep history was severed. Rebuilt Aachen is beautiful and functional, but fundamentally different from destroyed Aachen. This loss of historical continuity, of irreplaceable cultural heritage, of physical connection to past, is part of urban warfare's cost that statistics never capture. When cities are destroyed, humanity loses not just current structures, but accumulated history, cultural memory embedded in physical space, sense of connection across time that only old places provide. The veterans who fought at Aachen carried experience for the rest of their lives, mostly in silence. American veterans returned home to parades and public honor, but private nightmares. Most never discuss combat details with families, maintaining cheerful facade while wrestling internal demons. German veterans face different challenge, returning to defeated, occupied nation where military service was source of shame rather than pride. Some, like Wilk, lived quietly, avoiding attention. Others became bitter, nursing resentments about betrayal and unfair treatment. Many struggled with trauma they couldn't discuss in society, that wanted to forget, rather than process war experience. Therapy and counseling were largely unavailable. Veterans were expected to simply resume normal life. Most did, carrying burden invisibly, manifesting symptoms in alcoholism, relationship problems, unexplained rage or depression. Only in later decades, as PTSD became recognized, diagnosis and veteran support improved, could survivors finally access help, often 50 or 60 years after events that traumatized them. The final lesson of Aachen is the most important and most ignored. Urban warfare should be avoided when any alternative exists, because its costs exceed any reasonable definition of acceptable. Military forces train for urban combat because sometimes it's unavoidable, but training for contingency shouldn't become preference for method. Aachen could have been bypassed. The American advance could have continued around it, containing garrison, waiting for surrender forced by isolation. This would have taken longer, but cost fewer casualties, preserved the city, avoided civilian deaths. Similar alternatives existed in Manila, Hue, Grozny, Fallujah. Alternatives rejected because military culture prefers action to patience, because political leadership demands visible progress, because symbolic targets attract resources regardless of strategic logic. Until military and political leaders internalize that urban warfare's costs almost always exceed its benefits, Aachen will be repeated endlessly with different names and dates, but identical results. Destroyed cities, shattered lives, Pyrrhic victories that feel like defeats to everyone who participated. Aachen's shadow stretches across 80 years of urban warfare, touching every city fight that followed. The tactical innovations developed there, combined arms teams, careful building clearing procedures, specialized equipment, improved military effectiveness. The strategic lessons, urban warfare's disproportionate costs, fortress doctrine's failure, civilian protection's impossibility in urban combat remain largely unlearned. New generations of soldiers and civilians rediscover these lessons in ruins of Grozny, Mosul, Aleppo, Mariupol, adding their experiences to growing catalogue of urban warfare's horrors. Perhaps, someday, political and military leaders will genuinely understand that cities are where wars go to become atrocities, where military effectiveness and moral horror become inseparable, where winning and losing lose all meaning in universal suffering. Until that understanding becomes operational reality, instead of post-battle conclusion, Aachen's legacy will be repetition. The same lessons relearned in blood, the same mistakes repeated with slight variations, the same question asked by survivors: was this really necessary? And the same uncomfortable answer, probably not, but we did it anyway.